Welcome in. There is a slab of black marble set into the floor just inside the west door of Westminster Abbey. That is the only grave in the whole enormous building that nobody is permitted to walk across. Every bride who has been married there in the last century has gone around it. On a spring morning in 1923, a young woman on her way up that aisle to be married stopped beside it, took the white roses out of her own hands, and laid them down on the stone. Nobody had asked her to do it. She did that for a brother who had been killed in France and never brought home, and the gesture was so quiet that half the congregation did not notice it happening. Every royal bride since has copied her. That abbey is shut at this hour, and the candles are out, and everyone in the story I am about to tell you has been dead a long while now, which is exactly what makes it a safe place to fall asleep inside. This is for anyone who has got to the end of a day and found that being tired is not the same thing as being able to switch off. You do not have to keep hold of any of it. You are welcome to drift, and lose the thread, and come back somewhere in the middle, and none of it will mind. Tonight we are following that young woman from the very beginning. A Scottish castle full of children. A garden in Hertfordshire. A ward of wounded men in a room built for banquets. And a prince who asked her to marry him and was turned down flat, and then asked again, and was turned down again. What she could not have known, kneeling by that black stone with her arms suddenly empty, was that the crown she had spent 2 years refusing to go anywhere near was already on its way to her, and that it would arrive in the form of a letter written by a man she never forgave. She was a great writer of letters, this woman. She wrote them all her life, thousands upon thousands of them, to her governess and her sisters and her husband and her friends, in a fast looping hand that ran downhill across the page when she was in a hurry. Most of what we know about how she actually felt, as opposed to how she looked, comes from those letters, because she almost never said the difficult things aloud. So it seems only right that if you have something you would like to leave behind tonight, you are very welcome to leave it in the comments. I always like to know where in the world you have got to, and what the hour is where you are, whether it is late evening or the small hours or the middle of an afternoon somewhere on the other side of the world. I go through them, all of them, and they are a good deal more interesting than people imagine. And if these long evenings are something you would like to be able to find your way back to, you are welcome to subscribe, and then they will simply turn up. Picture this: a road in the county of Angus in eastern Scotland, running flat between fields of stubble. You come round a bend and the trees begin, and then there is a gateway, and then the avenue, which is a straight mile of it, running dead ahead through parkland. At the far end of that mile, something pink is standing up out of the ground. That is the first thing anyone says about Glamis. Pink. The sandstone came out of the local quarries with iron in it, and in certain lights, particularly the low light at the end of a summer day, the whole enormous pile of it goes the colour of a peach. Turrets, conical roofs like witches' hats, chimneys in bunches, small windows set high and irregular in a wall 17 feet thick at the base. It looks less like a house than like something that grew. The Lyon family had been standing on that ground for 528 years by the time Elizabeth was born there in the summers of her childhood, and they had the paperwork to prove it. In 1372, a man named John Lyon was granted the thanage of Glamis by King Robert II of Scotland. He then married the king's daughter, which is a thing that happens in old families and almost never happens again. He was Chamberlain of Scotland. He was murdered in a quarrel in 1382. His descendants held on. They kept holding on through everything Scotland did to itself over the next 5 centuries, which was a great deal. One of them was created Earl of Kinghorn by King James VI in 1606. His grandson took the longer title, Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, in 1677, and that is the title Elizabeth's father inherited when she was 3. Before that he was simply Lord Glamis, and she was the Honourable Elizabeth. After it she was Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and she was for the Bowes half of the name came in through money, as such halves usually do, and a heiress from County Durham, coal money, the 18th century. A condition of the marriage was that the husband take her surname, and rather than lose either one, the family stuck them together and kept both. That is how a Scottish house with a Norman French name ends up sounding like a firm of solicitors. What all this meant practically for a child born in 1900 was a building far too large to be a home and yet somehow used as one. There were 70-odd rooms at Glamis, and the family used a fraction of them. The great staircase is a stone spiral, wide enough for two, winding up through the tower with slit windows letting in blades of light at every turn. The walls in the older parts are so thick that the window recesses are small rooms in themselves, with stone seats built into them, and a child could sit in one of those recesses with her feet up and be entirely invisible from the room behind her. Elizabeth did. There are letters that mention it. The castle was cold. This is not a romantic detail. It is the central physical fact of the place, and everyone who ever stayed there said so. Fires were lit where the family sat and went out overnight, and the corridors between were freezing at any time of year. A guest walking from dinner to bed in November passed through air that had not been warm since spring. Her family were entirely used to it. Visitors were not, and their letters home are full of it. Against the cold there was the other thing Glamis had, which was noise. 10 children were born to Claude and Cecilia Bowes-Lyon between 1883 and 1902. One daughter died in childhood before Elizabeth arrived, so 9 of them grew up, spread over nearly 2 decades, which meant that the oldest was already a grown man with a commission in the Black Watch, while the youngest of them was still in the nursery. Elizabeth was the 9th. Her brother David came last, 15 months after her, and the 2 of them were so inseparable that the family gave them a joint name and called them the 2 Benjamins, after the youngest son of Jacob. They were, by every account that survives, a good deal less well behaved than the photographs suggest. There is a persistent family story that the 2 of them worked out how to get up into one of the turrets above the entrance with a jug, and that they would pour water down onto the heads of arriving guests and shriek that it was boiling oil. Another has the pair of them capturing an estate worker and holding him for ransom. Elizabeth spent a good part of her childhood in a costume, having discovered the trunks in the attics, and would arrive at the top of the stairs during grown-up gatherings dressed as somebody or other and expect to be received. And there was the other Glamis, the one that made the newspapers whenever the family was mentioned, which is the Glamis of the legends. The castle collected them the way old houses do. There was said to be a secret room somewhere in the walls that only the Earl, his heir and the factor were permitted to know about, and the story went that the 3 of them were told the secret on the heir's coming of age and that it changed him. A card game had been played against the devil. A lord had been walled up alive behind masonry. Guests were sometimes encouraged to go round the outside counting windows and then go round the inside counting rooms, and to notice that the sums did not agree. None of it was true in the way ghost stories are meant to be true, and the family knew perfectly well that none of it was true, and they enjoyed it enormously. Elizabeth grew up entirely unbothered. She had been running around the place since she could walk. A house that a nation finds frightening is simply the house where your grandmother's portrait hangs, and where the dogs sleep in the passage. And one of the small useful things she carried out of that childhood was a complete inability to be impressed by a building. Downstairs lay a chapel with painted panels, 17th century, the ceiling and walls covered with scenes, so that sitting in it felt like sitting inside an illuminated book. Beyond it, a drawing room with a plaster ceiling put up in the 1620s, heavy with wreaths and thistles. Below that, a crypt, low and vaulted, where the suits of armour stood in the dark. And beyond all of it, Out of the windows on the eastern side, the Angus fields ran away flat towards the sea, and the sky over them was enormous, and the light in the evening came in sideways and turned the sandstone, the colour I described to you. That was one half of the childhood. The family went north for the late summer and the autumn, for the shooting and for the long light, and there were house parties and cricket on the lawn, because her father was mad about cricket and had a private team. Then in the winter they went south. And the south was another world entirely, and in some ways the more important one, because that was where she said the happiest part of it happened. The other house sat in Hertfordshire, 30 miles north of London, and it was called St. Paul's Walden Bury. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained why it takes 4 words to say it. A red brick house of the early 18th century, and after the pink stone acreage of Glamis it must have felt like a doll's house, though it was in fact a proper country property with a walled garden and a home farm, and its own church down the lane. She was almost certainly not born there, though her birth is registered as if she was. Registration was made at Hitchin, the nearest town, and gave St. Paul's Walden Bury as the place. But her father did not get round to registering it for 6 weeks, which was past the legal limit, and he was fined 7 shillings and 6pence for the delay. Nobody in the family afterwards seemed entirely sure. Some said the London house. There was a persistent story, which she herself apparently rather liked, that it had happened in a horse-drawn ambulance somewhere in London on the way to a hospital. It is a strange thing to say about a woman who lived 101 years in the full light of the world, but the beginning of her is a genuine blank. She was christened at any rate in the Flint Church at St. Paul's Walden on the 23rd of September, and the entry in the parish book is legible and unarguable. But the garden was what mattered. The garden at St. Paul's Walden Bury is a formal one of the old style, laid out in the 1720s, and what makes it remarkable is that it is made almost entirely out of trees. Beech hedges 20 feet high, cut flat, run out from the house in long straight rides that converge and open into circular clearings and then narrow again. Statues stand at the ends of them. In summer the rides are green tunnels with the light coming through the leaves in that shifting underwater way, and in winter they are grey corridors of bare trunks with the ground crunching underfoot. For a child it is close to a perfect landscape, a maze that cannot get you seriously lost. Both she and David were let loose in it. A brick outbuilding stood at the edge of the wood, and the two of them took it over and made it their own, and they kept things in it, apples and a chocolate stash and old books, and it was understood to be theirs. There were bantams, there were dogs, an unbroken succession of them. A Shetland pony called Bobs lived there, small and stout, who would follow her about the place looking for food, and who once, according to family memory, came into the house after her. Presiding over the nursery end of all this was a Scottish farmer's daughter called Clara Knight, who had been nurse to Elizabeth's older sister before her. No child could manage Clara, so she became Allah, and Allah she remained for the rest of her life, through Elizabeth's childhood, and then decades later, through the childhoods of Elizabeth's own daughters. She was calm, entirely unflappable, and slightly deaf, and she did not much approve of fuss. It is worth pausing on the fact that the woman who ran the nursery of a Queen of England and 2 princesses was the same woman throughout, hired in the 1890s, still there in the 1930s. Continuity of that kind was one of the quiet luxuries of the world Elizabeth came from, and she noticed when it was gone. The parents were, by the standards of their class and their period, extraordinarily present. This is the thing that separates her upbringing from the upbringings of most of the people she would later spend her life among. Aristocratic children of 1900 were commonly handed to staff and produced at intervals. Cecilia Bowes-Lyon did not operate that way. She taught her own children to read. She taught them music, and taught it properly, so that Elizabeth could sit down at a piano at 4 and pick out a tune, and at 10 could play well enough to accompany other people. Dancing came from her too. She had them in and out of her sitting room all day. Elizabeth said later, describing the whole of it in one line, that what her mother gave the household was fun and kindness and a marvellous sense of security, and that is about as close as she ever came to an analysis of her own happiness. Claude, the father, is the harder one to see. He was a countryman who liked his trees and his shooting and his cricket and disliked London, ceremony, and being made to talk to strangers. He had a habit of quietly leaving. When the house filled with guests, he would go out to the estate. His pleasures were small and repeated, and he defended them, and he had one piece of advice for his youngest daughter that he gave her more than once as she grew up, which was to keep well clear of royal entanglements. He was not being clever. He simply thought it looked like a great deal of work and very little pleasure, and on that point he turned out to be very largely right. Life in the Hertfordshire house was informal in a way that Glamis could not be. Meals with the children at the table, the garden after breakfast, church down the lane on Sunday with the whole household walking, dogs everywhere, lessons in the morning, and not particularly rigorous ones, the village a short walk away, and the village people known by name, and the sort of easy small conversation with them that she was doing before she was 10 and never afterwards stopped doing. That, more than anything at Glamis, is where the thing she later became famous for was learned. She was educated, essentially, at home, and the educating was done by a series of women, and the story of those women tells you more about her than the story of any lesson. School happened briefly. 2 terms of it, in London, at a small establishment run by 2 sisters named Birtwistle, and it was not a success in any conventional sense, though she was clearly bright. The teachers were startled by her, asked to write an essay. At 9 or 10, she began it with 2 words of Greek lifted from Xenophon, having found them somewhere and liked the sound of them. Her strong subjects were literature and scripture. Her weak subject, by a distance, was arithmetic, which never improved, and about which she was entirely unrepentant for the rest of her life. Then home again, and a German governess called Cathay Kubler, who was young and serious and Jewish, and who took her seriously, and under whose teaching Elizabeth sat the Oxford local examination at 13 and passed it with distinction. That is a real qualification, sat by a real examining board, and it is a small corrective to the standard picture of the accomplished aristocratic girl with a scrapbook and a smattering of French. Work she could do when she chose to. And then in 1914 came Beryl Poignant, who was engaged as a governess, and who became something else entirely. Beryl was in her early 20s. Elizabeth was 13, going on 14. What developed was less a schoolroom relationship than a friendship, and the reason we know anything about the interior life of the young Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at all is that when they were apart she wrote to Beryl constantly, for years, in an unguarded, funny, slangy, self-mocking voice that appears nowhere else in the record. Those letters survived. They are the single most valuable thing we have of her before the age of 20, and they show a girl who noticed everything, laughed at nearly all of it, and was already very good at not saying the thing she actually minded. The formal accomplishments were all in place. Piano properly, dancing properly, French adequately, a great deal of memorized verse which stayed with her, and which she would still be quoting in her 90s. Riding, though she was never one of the fanatical horsewomen the family produced. Handwriting, that fast downhill hand, and the constant background education of a large house running, the seeing of how a household works, who does what, which door leads where, what a butler needs to be told and what he does not, how long a dinner takes, and how to know when a room has gone flat. That last item is the one that turns out to matter. There is a quality Elizabeth had, remarked on by everybody who ever met her, from the earliest days right through to the very end, and it is not beauty and it is not wit, though she had a fair amount of both. It is the ability to arrive in a room and make the people in it feel better than they had felt a minute earlier. Her governess described her as being older than her years and able to put anyone at ease. She was 5'2", dark-haired, with very blue eyes, and she was not conventionally the prettiest girl in any room she entered. She simply had a way of turning the whole of her attention onto one person for as long as she was speaking to them, and of appearing delighted to be exactly where she was. It is worth being clear-eyed about this, because it is easy to sentimentalize. That manner was partly natural warmth, and partly, from very early on, a technique. She was aware of its effect. She used it. In a family of 9, a child works out fairly quickly what gets her the room's attention, and in her case what worked was charm rather than noise, and she polished it accordingly. Later, professionally, it would be worth more to the British monarchy than any policy anybody had, but it started as a small girl's ordinary domestic trick, learned at St. Paul's Walden Bury among people who loved her anyway. Against this, the same childhood was teaching her something harder, which was that you do not discuss what hurts. Her family did not do it. Her mother was religious in a practical, undemonstrative way, and her response to grief was work. When the Bowes-Lyon family was struck by things, and they were struck repeatedly, the household simply went on. The training was thorough, and it lasted. Right through her life, the moments where the record shows her genuinely knocked sideways are moments you have to infer from what she stopped writing about rather than from what she wrote. So there she is at the beginning of the summer of 1914-13, nearly 14. Small, dark, funny, a good pianist, hopeless at sums, adored by a much older set of brothers, joined at the hip to the youngest one, in and out of 2 houses in 2 countries, with a governess she can tell anything to, and a mother who has never once made her feel like an item on a schedule. Her world consists of about 400 people, all of whom she knows, and it has never occurred to her that it could contain anybody else. Her birthday was coming. She was to be taken to London for it, to the theatre, as a treat, on the 4th of August. Her treat had been arranged weeks in advance. Her 14th birthday fell on a Tuesday, and the family were in London, and she was to be taken out for the evening to the Coliseum in St. Martin's Lane, which was the grandest variety theatre in the country, and had a revolving stage and a lift, and a great deal of gold paint. There would be a bill of turns. There would be supper. Her brother Jock came, and friends, and it was exactly the sort of birthday a girl of that age in that family could expect, and by any ordinary measure it went perfectly well. That date was the 4th of August, 1914. What she noticed first were the streets. Getting to the theatre meant getting through crowds, and the crowds were not theatre crowds. They were standing about in the way people stand when they are waiting for something to be announced. There were boys selling papers and shouting the headlines, and the shouting was continuous. Men in the street were singing, not drunkenly, or not only drunkenly. Whole sections of a road would be singing the same thing at once, and then it would fall away, and then start again somewhere further down. Britain's ultimatum to Germany expired at 11 o'clock that night. Nobody in the audience at the Coliseum knew the exact hour, but everybody knew what was coming, and the atmosphere in the building was extraordinary. Every patriotic number brought the house up out of its seats. She remembered the singing more than anything on the stage. They came out into a city that had gone off its head with excitement. Crowds were pouring down towards Trafalgar Square and along the Mall towards the Palace, thousands of them, and there was cheering going up from the direction of the gates. When war was declared at 11, the noise was audible across half of central London. She was 14, and she had spent the evening inside the last hours of the 19th century without knowing it. I want to be careful here, because the temptation with a moment like that is to make the girl prophetic, and she was not. She was thrilled. Everybody was thrilled. She was a schoolroom girl with 4 brothers of fighting age, in a country that had not fought a European war in living memory, and the general opinion in the streets that night was that the thing would be finished by Christmas, and that the difficulty would be getting out there in time to see any of it. Her brothers went almost at once. Patrick, the eldest, and Jock were already in the Black Watch, the Highland regiment the family had been putting sons into for generations. Fergus went to the 8th Battalion of the same regiment within a fortnight. Michael, who was at Oxford, took a commission in the Royal Scots, 4 of them. Their mother had 9 living children, and 4 of them were gone inside a month. Fergus did something else first. He was engaged, and rather than wait, he married. Their wedding was on the 17th of September, 6 weeks after the Declaration, and it was the kind of hurried wartime wedding that within a year would be so common that nobody remarked on it. But in that first autumn it still felt like a decision. His bride was Lady Christian Dawson Damer. He was 25. He went out to train his new battalion almost immediately afterwards, and the family went north to Glamis, as they always did at the end of summer, except that this year nothing about it was the same. The house parties did not happen. The cricket did not happen. Half the male staff of the estate had gone to enlist, and the ones who had not gone were talking about going. Elizabeth's lessons continued in theory. In practice, her mother had begun to think about beds, because this was what happened in country houses everywhere that first autumn, all across Britain, in a matter of weeks. The War Office needed places to put men who were wounded but not dying, men who needed months rather than surgery, and the country was suddenly full of enormous private buildings with more rooms than occupants. Some owners were approached. Many, like Cecilia Bowes-Lyon, simply offered. By the close of it, the dining room at Glamis, which had a very fine ceiling and had been built for entertaining, had beds down both sides of it. Elizabeth was too young to nurse. That was the rule, and it was not negotiable. And her sister Rose, who was 24, went off to London in the January to train properly at a hospital in Marylebone. Elizabeth stayed, which meant that from the age of 14 to the age of 18, this girl lived in a building that was half her family home and half a ward. And what she did there, over those 4 winters, without anybody planning it or noticing it or writing it down as a training of any kind, turned out to be the exact apprenticeship for the rest of her life. They came up on the train from the south, and then out by road from the station, and they arrived at Glamis in batches in the blue uniforms that convalescent soldiers were issued with, and they were, almost all of them, ordinary men. That is the fact to hold on to. Her family knew a great many people, and every single one of those people belonged to a world of about the same 3,000 or 4,000 families. Elizabeth, at 14, had almost certainly never held a real conversation with a working man who was not employed by her father. Now there were 1,500 of them over the course of the war, coming through her house in batches of 30 and 40, from Dundee and Glasgow and Manchester and the Fife Pits and the Lanarkshire Mills, and she was the daughter of the house and she was 14, and there was very little for her to do except talk to them. So she talked to them. This is the whole of it, and it does not sound like much. Errands into the village were hers, buying tobacco and stamps and combs and the small things a man in a strange house has no way of getting for himself. She wrote letters for the ones who could not, taking dictation to wives and mothers, which meant she was writing the most intimate sentences of a stranger's life at the age of 15, and had to learn very quickly how not to react to any of it. Cards were played, badly and often. The gramophone was her department. Somebody got the billiard table going again, and it was her. She led people about the castle, telling them the ghost stories, which went down enormously well, and she was quite prepared to embellish, One of the soldiers wrote a line in her autograph book that has survived. He said she ought to be hung, drawn and quartered, hung in diamonds, drawn in a coach and four, and quartered in the finest house in the land. He meant it as a joke. It is also read now one of the more accurate predictions anybody made in that decade. One shift in her the letters do show, and that nobody at the time would have called anything. She stopped being shy of illness. Men in a convalescent ward are not decorative. They are in pain. They are bored. They are frightened of going back. They are missing limbs. They have lungs that will never be right. They wake in the night. A girl of 15 either learns to walk into that room easily or she avoids the room. She learned to walk in. What she learned in there was a technique, and I have said already that she had the beginnings of it before the war. This was where it got its finish. Full attention on one man. The right question, which was never about the wound. Interest that was not performed. The trick of leaving a room having made everyone in it feel slightly larger than they had felt when she came in. 30 years on, standing in a bombed street in the East End of London talking to a woman who had lost a house, she was doing precisely what she had learned to do at 15 among the beds in Angus. She was doing it for the same reason. Everybody who watched it said the same thing, which was that it did not look like a performance because it was not one. Then, in September 1916, the castle caught fire. It started in the upper floors of the central tower, where the water tank was, and it was noticed by chance in the middle of the day, 60 feet up, in a building of enormous stone thicknesses with wooden floors and centuries of dry timber, and the nearest fire brigade at Forfar and Dundee, which meant a considerable wait. Family and servants and the soldiers who were fit enough formed a chain. Elizabeth was 16. She telephoned for the brigade. When the water began to come down the main stair in a torrent, threatening the whole ground floor and everything in it, she was in the middle of the effort to get the contents out, directing people, and one account has her taking charge of a hose. Somebody thought to go outside and roll back the lead on the flat roof to let the water off. The house was saved, with the top of the tower gutted. Nobody was killed. In the middle of the worst of the war, it was a strangely energizing day, and the letters about it are almost cheerful. 2 summers on, the family had another 2 months of the other kind of waiting. In April 1917, Michael, the brother in the Royal Scots, was reported missing. That word did the particular work it did in that war. It meant nothing was known. It usually meant dead. The War Office in due course wrote to say that he must be presumed killed, and the household began to behave accordingly, except for David, the youngest, who was 15, and who flatly refused. He told the family that he had seen Michael in a dream, in a house with a bandage round his head, and that he was alive. Exactly the sort of thing a devastated boy says. 3 months later the news came through that Michael was a prisoner of war in Germany, wounded, and that he would be coming home when it was over. He did come home, but another letter had already arrived at Glamis, 2 autumns earlier, and that one had been no mistake. Fergus was the 4th of the 10 children and the 3rd son, and by every account he was the easiest of them. He was a cricketer. He played in the annual matches on the ground at Glamis, which his father cared about more than almost anything else, and he had the sort of temperament that makes a family gathering better simply by being in the room. He was 11 years older than Elizabeth. To a girl of 14, he was not a contemporary. He was one of the tall grown-up brothers who came and went and teased and were away at school and then away in the regiment, and who were therefore slightly magnificent. He had been married for a year and 8 days. His daughter Rosemary had been born on the 18th of July, 1915, and he had come home on leave in the August and seen her, and that leave was short, and he had gone back. That is the whole of what he had of his own family. 8 weeks. On the 25th of September the British attacked at Loos. in the coalfields of northern France. That was the largest British attack of the war so far, and the first time the British Army used gas. The 8th Battalion of the Black Watch went in with it. 2 days later, Fergus was ordered to clear a group of German soldiers who had got into a trench at a position called the Hohenzollern Redoubt, and while he was leading that attack, he was killed. He was 26. Fergus was buried where he fell, in a disused quarry near the village of Vermelles. That ground was fought over repeatedly for 3 more seasons, and the graves in it were lost. And when the war ended and the cemeteries were made and the registers compiled, his was one of the many for which there was no location. His name went on the loose memorial with 20,000 others whose graves the war had swallowed. It was not until nearly a century afterwards, when a grandson brought family papers to the war graves people, that the quarry was identified and a headstone was finally cut for him. News reached Glamis in early October. What happened next is one of those things the record gives you sideways. Cecilia Bowes-Lyon, who had raised 10 children and buried one already, who had turned her own dining room into a hospital and worked in it daily, who was by universal description the animating spirit of that entire family, stopped. Not in a dramatic or a public way. She was ill for a long time afterwards, and then she was ill again, and she withdrew from the running of the house, and she withdrew from society altogether, and she stayed withdrawn a long while. Inside the family they said she was never the same. She had a serious operation in 1921 and a long convalescence after it. The next thing that genuinely pulled her back into the world was her youngest daughter's engagement, 8 winters later, and the 15-year-old girl in the house took over a good deal of the running of it, not the hospital administration, which had staff. The other thing, the greeting of new arrivals, keeping the tone of it, the carrying of the household through an autumn in which its centre had gone quiet. There is a version of this story where that is presented as noble, and I would rather present it as what it actually was, which is a bereaved child doing the job in front of her, because the alternative was that nobody did it. She did not talk about Fergus. This is the pattern I mentioned earlier, and it holds for the whole of her life. Her letters to Beryl Poignand in that period are the same funny, slangy letters as before, with a line or two about how dreadful it all is, and then on to something else. No outpouring, no reflection anywhere. There is a girl who has been taught very thoroughly that the way you handle grief is by continuing to be pleasant to people, and who will now do that without deviation for the next 87 years. The one time she let it show, she did it without saying anything at all. She was 22, walking up the aisle of Westminster Abbey in front of a congregation of 2,000 people, with the whole of the British press outside, and every photographer in London on the pavement. She stopped. Her flowers went down on a grave that had been made 3 years earlier for a soldier nobody could name, brought back from France to stand for all the ones who had not come back. But then she went on and got married. She never explained it. Every royal bride in Britain since has done the same thing, and a good many of them have no idea that the whole tradition began with a girl thinking about her brother. The armistice came on the 11th of November, 1918, and Elizabeth was 18, and the world that came back was not the one that had gone away. Start with the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is the story of her entire generation of women. Something like 750,000 men from Britain did not come home. Heaviest losses fell on exactly the age group that a girl of 18 would have expected to marry, and disproportionately on exactly her class, because subalterns led from the front and died at a rate that outran the ranks. Of the boys she had grown up dancing with at Christmas parties, and the brothers of the girls she knew, a great many were not there. The census of 1921 found close to 2 million more women than men in England and Wales, and the newspapers gave them a name that stuck for a generation, and was meant unkindly. The surplus women. Against that background, a small, dark young woman of 20 who was funny, who danced well, who listened, and who had spent 4 years learning how to make wounded men feel better was going to have a very particular kind of success. She had it immediately. That first season after the peace, and the one after it, were the first proper ones since before the war. They were danced with an intensity that people who were there remembered ever afterwards as slightly unhinged. Everything had been suspended for the duration. Money was about in some quarters and grief in all of them, and the response was jazz bands and dancing until 4, and the new steps that came in from America and horrified the mothers. Elizabeth was presented at court in the summer of 1920. She went to everything. Her name is in the papers constantly through both seasons, in the lists of who was at which ball, and it appears in the diaries and letters of half the young men in London, and the tone in all of them is the same. Everybody was slightly in love with her, not because she was the outstanding beauty of the season, because she was the person you wanted to be sitting next to. There is a photograph from around then, one of the Bassanio portraits, and it explains a certain amount. She is small and dark, and the eyes are extraordinarily blue and are looking directly at you, and there is an amusement in the face that the photographer has failed to make formal. She looks like somebody about to say something. Glamis, meanwhile, had become one of the great destinations of that particular circle. The house filled up in the late summer with young people, and there was the shooting and the cricket and the long light and the charades and the reels in the evening, and a stream of guests who had never seen anything like it. For a certain kind of well-brought-up English girl or boy, arriving at Glamis in 1920 was arriving at a place that felt older and warmer and stranger than anywhere at home, presided over by a family who did not appear to think any of it remarkable. Among the young men there was one who mattered more than the rest, and his name was James Stuart. He was a third son of the Earl of Moray, which is another very old Scottish family, and he was tall and good-looking and had a military cross that he had earned in the trenches, and he was by all accounts the outstanding young man of his set. He had been through the whole war. He was funny. He was, by every version of the story that has ever been told, the man Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was actually in love with when she was 20. Nothing about that romance is fully documented, because the letters that would have settled it were destroyed or never written, and the people involved were of a class and a generation that did not discuss such things at any point in their lives. What is certain is that they saw a great deal of each other in 1920 and 1921, that everyone around them assumed something was happening, and that in the end nothing came of it. Because James Stuart had a job. That same year he became equerry to the king's second son, a shy young man of 24 who had just been created Duke of York, and in the ordinary course of that job, in the summer of that year, he brought his employer to a dance. That dance was at the Ritz in London on the 8th of July, 1920. Somebody had given it for the Royal Air Force. Elizabeth was there. So was the Duke of York, who was doing what he always did at dances, which was standing slightly apart wishing he were somewhere else. That they had met before, glancingly, as children at a party long before. This was the first time either of them registered it. He asked who she was, and that, as far as the rest of the 20th century is concerned, is where the thing starts. To understand what happened over the following 3 seasons, you have to understand the man, and the man is far more interesting than the standard picture of a nervous prince with a stammer. That he was born on the 14th of December, 1895, which was in that family an unfortunate date, because it was the anniversary of the death of the Prince Consort, and his great-grandmother Queen Victoria still kept it annually as a day of mourning. His family were nervous about telling her. Victoria was in the event rather charmed, and the boy was given the name Albert and called Bertie inside the family, and there is something faintly ominous in a child arriving with an apology attached to his birthday. Bertie was the second son. That is the largest single fact about the first 4 decades of his life. His elder brother David, later Edward VIII, was blonde and quick and charming and effortless, and was going to be king. Bertie was none of those things and was not going to be anything in particular, which in that position is either a liberty or a sentence depending entirely on the family you are in. The family was George V's, and George V was a naval officer of the old school who ran his household like a quarterdeck and could not talk to his children without inspecting them. He was not a cruel man. He was a man with no capacity whatsoever for the emotional life of a child, and a very loud voice, and an eye for anything out of place. Bertie was knock-kneed as a small boy, and was put into splints, worn at night and for hours in the day, painful and useless. He was naturally left-handed, and was made to write with his right hand. And from about the age of 8 he began to stammer. There is no mystery about why that combination of things happened to that child in that house, and there is no need to be reductive about it either. What matters is the effect. He stammered on the hard consonants, and the king's names for things were full of them, and the more he was corrected, the worse it became. A stammering boy in a family that valued fluency, next to a brother who could charm a room without trying, learns 2 lessons very early. Silence is safer, and rage is what comes up when silence fails. Both of those stayed with him. The household called his tempers his gnashes. Osborne came first, then Dartmouth as a naval cadet, which was the standard route for a second son, and he came out of the first of those examinations 68th out of 68. He was not stupid. He was frightened, and he could not speak. And then, at 20, he was at Jutland. This is the part of his life that almost nobody knows and that he would not have let anybody forget. In May 1916, he was a sub-lieutenant aboard the battleship Collingwood in the North Sea, and he had been ill for months with a stomach complaint that would eventually turn out to be an ulcer, and he was actually in his sick bay when the action began. He got up, went to his turret, and stayed there through the battle. He mentioned afterwards in a letter having gone up on top of the turret to watch, which is the single most revealing thing he ever wrote about himself. 15 years on, the stammering, deferential, anxious Duke could put on a uniform and stand in a room full of admirals as a man who had been at the biggest naval battle in British history. He had done his job in it. He had been sick to his stomach the whole time, and had gone anyway. The ulcer eventually took him out of the Navy. He had an operation in 1917. He transferred to the new air service, learned to fly, and qualified as a pilot the year after the war ended, which, for a man of his nerves, was another quiet act of stubbornness. A year at Cambridge followed, and in June 1920, his father created him Duke of York, which was the title George V himself had held as a second son, and which came with the clear expectation that he would now do the dull public work while his brother did the glamorous kind. He did it well, and in a way nobody expected. He got interested in industry, of all things, in the conditions of factory work, and he went round works and yards and mills, and became president of the Industrial Welfare Society, and the press, which is unkind about everything, called him the Industrial Prince. He set up an annual summer camp that put working boys and public school boys under canvas together for a fortnight, and he went to it every summer and sat on the grass in the middle of them singing. He kept it going for 18 summers. So the man standing at the edge of the dance floor at the Ritz in July 1920 was this, 24, blue-eyed, thin, extremely fit, a decent tennis player, painfully shy in company, and dogged as an ox underneath it, prone to sudden fury and instant remorse, Frightened of his father, devoted to his mother in a formal sort of way that got him nothing, and utterly without the one thing his elder brother had in surplus, which was ease. Underneath all of it, and this is the part that decided everything, was an enormous capacity for constancy. He was not a man who fell in love easily or often. When he did not stop. He began appearing at things. That is how it went, through the back end of that year and into the next. Wherever the Strathmores were, the Duke of York turned up. There were visits to Glamis. He danced with her, badly at first, and then better. He wrote. He came again. His equerry James Stuart was often in the same house at the same time, which must have been an atmosphere, and there is no record of what either man said to the other about it, because of course there is not. In the spring of 1921, he told his father that he wanted to marry her, and that he wanted to marry nobody else. George V, who liked Elizabeth very much and who was normally difficult about everything, gave his blessing in a single dry sentence to the effect that his son would be a lucky fellow if she said yes. He had no idea how prescient he was being. His proposal came that spring. He did not make it himself. He sent a friend of the family to sound her out, which was not unusual in that world, and was in his case almost certainly about the stammer, and the answer came back, no. She meant it. This is the thing that gets flattened in the retelling, where two refusals become a coquette playing a long game, and that reading does not survive contact with what she wrote at the time. Her objection was not to him. Her objection was to the whole apparatus, and she named it exactly. She did not want to be never again free to think and speak and act as she felt she ought. She was 20. She had grown up in a family that ate meals together and walked to church and told jokes at the table, with a father who had told her more than once to stay well away from royal entanglements, and she had watched enough of that court from the outside to know that what was being offered was a life lived entirely in public with the interesting parts removed. She also, in all probability, was in love with somebody else, and here the story acquires an edge that the official accounts smooth over. In the middle of 1922, James Stuart left royal service and went to the United States to work in the oil business in Oklahoma for a great deal more money. That is the polite version, and it may well be the true one. The other version, which was believed by a good many people at the time and has been printed a great many times since, is that a word was put in, and an opportunity was arranged, and a young man of no fortune was helped to see the advantages of a career several thousand miles from London. Nothing was ever proved. Stuart himself came back, went into politics, and ended up Secretary of State for Scotland, and never said a word about any of it in public in his life. Meanwhile, Queen Mary went to Glamis. She went in the September of 1921, ostensibly on an ordinary visit, actually to look at the girl. Queen Mary was not a woman who did things by halves, and she was not sentimental about marriage in the least. Queen Mary inspected the house, the mother, the manners, and the girl, and she came away entirely convinced. She said afterwards that Elizabeth was the one girl who could make Bertie happy. She then did something that was completely out of character for a queen of that period, and that her son can only have found maddening, which is that she declined to interfere. No pressure, no summons, no arrangement. If it was going to happen, it was going to happen because Elizabeth chose it. In February 1922, Elizabeth was a bridesmaid at the wedding of the Duke's sister Princess Mary at Westminster Abbey, her first proper appearance inside the machine, walking up that aisle in the middle of a state occasion with the crowds outside and the cameras going, and she was noticed, and the papers ran her picture. She would have seen very clearly what the job looked like from the inside. A month later he proposed again, in person this time. She refused him again, and that ought to have been the end of it. In that world, in that decade, a young woman who has said no twice to the king's son has closed the subject permanently, and everybody involved understood as much. Her mother thought it was finished. The court thought it was finished. What nobody had properly reckoned with was the constancy I mentioned. He simply did not stop. He wrote to her. He went on seeing her. He made, over the following months, no dramatic gesture of any kind, and applied no pressure, and offered no ultimatum, and was just persistently, unglamorously there, which for a man of that temperament was the largest thing he had to give, and was, in the end, exactly the argument that worked. The autumn of 1922 went by. Her mother was recovering from a serious operation. Her closest brother David had gone up to Oxford. The house at St. Paul's, Waldenbury, was quiet in the way that houses go quiet when a family has finished being a family with children in it. She was 22, and she had been out for 3 seasons, and the merry-go-round of dances that had been thrilling at 19 was showing itself for what it was. He came down to Hertfordshire in the January. It was a Sunday, the 13th of January 1923, and it was a cold, clear morning of the sort Hertfordshire does well in the middle of winter, and they went out into the garden. Not the ornamental part near the house. The other part, the long green rides between the beech hedges where she had been running about since she could walk, and where the trees in January are bare and grey, and let a great deal of light down onto the grass. That was the landscape she knew better than any other in the world. Whether he understood that he was proposing to her in the one place where she was most entirely herself, or whether it was simply where the walk happened to go, nobody has ever known. He asked her. She said yes. What he did next is better than any amount of romantic writing. He had arranged a code in advance with his parents who were at Sandringham. If it went wrong, he would say nothing. If it went right, he would send 3 words. The telegram that went off from Hertfordshire that morning said that all was right, and it was signed Bertie, and that was the whole of it. Why she changed her mind is the question that hangs over the entire rest of her life, and the honest answer is that she never said, not to anyone, or that what can be set down is what had altered in 18 months. She had watched a man who could have had almost any unmarried woman in the country decline to look at anybody else for 2 years. She had been given no pressure of any kind by the Queen, who could have applied it and chose not to. The other young man had gone abroad. Her mother was recovering from a serious illness. Her closest brother was up at Oxford. The house she had grown up in was emptying, and the 3rd London season had come round again with the same faces doing the same things. And she had come to understand, in a way she almost certainly did not at 20, what it is to be loved by somebody with no talent whatsoever for insincerity. There is a line in a letter of hers, quoted a great deal, and usually quoted wrongly. She had felt it was right to marry him, and she fell in love with him afterwards. That is not a cynical sentence. Anybody who has been in a long marriage recognizes the shape of it exactly. News of the engagement went out on the 16th of January, and the country went slightly mad. It is difficult now to convey how novel this was. She was not a princess of any foreign house. She was the daughter of a Scottish earl, which made her an aristocrat but not royalty, and no son of a reigning British king had married a woman from outside the royal houses of Europe in living memory. The newspapers understood immediately what they had, which was a domestic story with a girl in it, and they went at it. Photographers stood outside the house in Bruton Street. Her clothes were described. Her hair was described. One word appeared in almost every paper, and that word was smile. One mistake she made in that fortnight, and never made another. Approached by a reporter from a London evening paper, she talked to him, pleasantly, briefly, and about nothing whatsoever, and the resulting article was harmless. Word came down to her, from a great height, that members of the royal family did not give interviews to newspapers. She took the instruction on board so thoroughly that in the following 79 years she never gave another, not one, to anybody on any subject. It is one of the most complete silences in modern public life, and it began that January. Her father, who had spent a decade advising her to stay away from precisely this, said nothing critical in public and gave her away in April. Her mother came back to life. Cecilia Bowes-Lyon, who had been a semi-invalid and out of society since the news came from France in 1915, took hold of the wedding of her youngest daughter, and there are letters from that spring which are the first cheerful letters she had written since the war. Her ring was sapphire with diamonds. She wore it for the rest of her life. And the man who had asked her, in a private letter to his mother, said that he was the luckiest man in the world, and that he could not believe it had happened, and there is no reason at all to think he was performing. He had spent his entire childhood being the one who was not chosen for anything. He was 27, and somebody had finally picked him. They were married on the 26th of April, 1923, in Westminster Abbey. That choice was itself a piece of thinking. Royal weddings in the previous century had been small affairs in private chapels, at St. James's or at Windsor, seen by a few hundred people who were already inside the world. The Abbey put it in the middle of London, on a route with the whole city able to line the road. Britain in 1923 was 4 years out of a war that had killed 750,000 of its men in the middle of an unemployment crisis. With strikes coming and a monarchy in Russia recently murdered and monarchies in Germany and Austria simply gone, the men around the king had worked out, correctly, that what the institution now needed was to be visibly a family rather than a court. So 1 million people came out onto the streets, and it rained in the morning, and then it stopped. Her dress was made by a London house, Madame Handley Seymour, and it was not a fashionable dress in the terms of 1923. Deliberately medieval, it was. Ivory chiffon noir, cut straight and simple with long sleeves, deep bands of embroidery, a train of Nottingham lace, and over the whole thing a veil of old Point de Flandres lace lent by her mother-in-law. She wore it low across the forehead in a band, which is how brides had worn veils 3 centuries earlier, and not at all how brides wore them in that decade. 3 minutes late, which for that period was practically punctual, and she came in through the west door with her father, and 8 bridesmaids behind her in white chiffon with green tulle at the waists. And she stopped. The grave of the unknown warrior had been made 2.5 years before, in November 1920. A body had been chosen at random from the battlefields of France, so that no family could ever be told it was not theirs, and it had been brought back and buried just inside the west door, with soil from the battlefields packed around it, in a spot every visitor must pass. All of Britain understood what it was for. There were something like 500,000 families in the country, with a man whose grave nobody could point to, and she was one of them. Her brother Fergus had been buried in a quarry near Vermelles that the war had since erased, and at that date there was no headstone anywhere on earth with his name cut into it. So she stepped aside from the procession and laid her bouquet of white roses down on the black marble, and walked on up the aisle without it. She had not told anybody she was going to do it. She never explained it afterwards. The Abbey ran the tradition backwards from that morning, and every royal bride since has left her flowers on that stone, though the modern practice is to send them back after the ceremony rather than to arrive holding them. It is the single most eloquent thing Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon ever did, and she did it without a word, which was very much her method. Everything after that was conventional. The Archbishop of Canterbury preached and said something about neither of them thinking of the crowds, which was well meant. The one modern element was refused. The wireless people asked whether the wedding might be broadcast, and the Abbey clergy turned it down on the grounds that men in public houses might listen to it without taking their hats off. 4 years on, they had changed their minds. That is the speed at which the 20th century arrived. Afterwards, there was the balcony at Buckingham Palace, and the crowd in front of the gates, and the noise of it. Now she was Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York, and that mattered more than it sounds. She had been Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at breakfast, and by lunch she outranked her own father, and everybody she had grown up with. That transition is one a great many people have made badly. She made it, by every account, without any visible effort at all, which was partly temperament and partly that long apprenticeship in a hospital ward, learning that the trick of a room is to make other people comfortable in it. They went to Polesden Lacey in Surrey for the first part of the honeymoon, a large Edwardian house belonging to a rich and formidable friend of the family, and then north to Glamis, where the weather was atrocious, and where the bride promptly caught whooping cough. She wrote to a friend that it was not a very romantic disease. That letter is the first surviving piece of evidence that becoming royal had not altered her sense of humour by a single degree. What she had married into took a little while to become clear, and the first thing it meant was a house she did not want. White Lodge sat in the middle of Richmond Park, a white Georgian building of considerable beauty and total impracticality, and it had been chosen for them by Queen Mary, who had lived in it herself, and was sentimental about it. 8 miles from central London, which in 1923 meant a long cold drive after every evening engagement. Expensive to run. It was damp. The heating was inadequate, and the kitchens were a very long way from the dining room, and the public could see straight in from the park. They lasted 3 years unhappily, both escaping to London. Being handed the wrong house by an older woman who cannot be contradicted is the standard opening move of married life in that family, and she took it with fairly good grace. But the letters make her feelings on the subject entirely legible. Work began immediately, and the work is the thing worth looking at, because this is where the girl from Glamis turned into a professional. In the autumn of 1923, they were sent to Belgrade for the wedding of the King of Yugoslavia. Her husband stood as best man. She stood as godmother to the infant crown prince at his christening, and during that ceremony the elderly patriarch performing the baptism lost his grip on the baby, who went into the font and very nearly under, and it was the Duke of York who reached in and got him out and held on to him for the rest of the service. The story went round Europe. It is also a fairly exact picture of the man she had married. Silent, awkward, and entirely reliable in the 2 seconds when something actually goes wrong. Then, Northern Ireland. Then, in the winter of 1924, a long tour of East Africa and the Sudan that lasted 4 months and included weeks of camping and shooting in Kenya and Uganda and a slow journey down the Nile. They were away from Christmas until April. It was the last extended period of privacy either of them would have for 28 years, and both of them talked about it afterwards as one of the happiest stretches of their lives. And in between all of it, the ordinary machinery. Hospitals, factories, foundation stones, regimental inspections, charity dinners. The Duke of York was the second son, and the second son does the engagements the heir cannot be bothered with, which in the 1920s meant an enormous quantity of provincial industrial visiting in the rain. Here is what changed. Before 1923, a visit by the Duke of York was a dutiful, awkward, rather stiff occasion, because that is what he was in public, and there was nothing to leaven it. From the spring of the wedding onward, there were 2 of them, and the other one was extraordinary at exactly the thing he could not do. Her technique was the one she had been assembling since childhood and finishing in a ward at Glamis. She looked at people, not past them, at them, and for slightly longer than expected. A question, then a wait for the answer, which sounds like nothing, and is in fact rare in public life indeed. She was interested in the specific person in front of her rather than in the category they represented, and because she was small and had to look up at most people, that the whole exchange had an unforced quality that no amount of coaching produces. And she smiled. This became so much her identity that it was later parodied, and it is worth saying that the smile was not simple. It was armour as much as warmth. Behind it she was watching everything and giving away nothing at all, and people who worked for her for decades said they never once knew what she was thinking unless she chose to tell them. Fleet Street adored her from the first month and never really stopped. Set beside Queen Mary, who was magnificent and rigid and terrifying, and stood like a monument, this small dark young woman who laughed and got wet in the rain and stopped to talk to somebody's grandmother read as something entirely new. One word was used about her constantly in that decade, and it was human. Her husband watched it work. There was no jealousy in him about it, none at all, and that is the other half of why the marriage functioned. He knew exactly what she was worth to him. What he could not manage was the talking, and she could talk to anybody, and so they went round the country together with him doing the substance and her doing the atmosphere, and in the meantime the thing that was eating him alive went on eating him, because he still could not get through a speech. Their first child was born at 2:40 in the morning on the 21st of April 1926 at number 17 Bruton Street, which was her parents' London house, because the Yorks still had nowhere in town of their own. Hers was a difficult birth. The official announcement used a form of words about a certain line of treatment having been successfully adopted, which was the period's way of saying a caesarean section, a thing not then done lightly. The Home Secretary was in the house. That was the custom, dating back 2 centuries to a scandal, about a baby smuggled into a royal bedchamber in a warming pan, and it meant that a middle-aged politician sat in a room downstairs at 2 in the morning waiting to be told that a child had been produced, and the practice was not abandoned until 1948. Their baby was a girl. She was christened Elizabeth Alexandra Mary 5 weeks later, in the private chapel at Buckingham Palace, and she was third in line to the throne, behind her uncle and her father, and nobody in that chapel had the slightest expectation that she would ever come to it. Her uncle was 31, unmarried, the most popular man in the British Empire, and uncertain to marry and have children of his own. 12 days after the christening, the country stopped. The general strike of 1926 brought out 1.5 million men and shut the railways and the docks and the printing presses for nights. This is the world the baby was born into. A Britain still shaking, still short of a generation of men with real hunger in the mining valleys and real anger in the cities, and a monarchy that had survived the previous decade largely by making itself look like a family with a pram in it. Into the nursery came a la. Clara Knight was in her mid-40s by then. She had been Elizabeth's own nurse in Hertfordshire, and her sisters before that, and she came now to run the top floor of a royal household, and she ran it exactly as she had run the other ones. Regular hours, fresh air, no fuss. A woman who had been in the family so long that she predated the mother she now worked for. I want to be honest about the shape of this, because it is the least comfortable part of the story and it is usually skated over. 4 years on there was a second daughter. Margaret Rose was born at Glamis on the 21st of August 1930, in the middle of a thunderstorm, the first royal child born in Scotland in more than 3 centuries. The Home Secretary of the day, a former millboy from Oldham who had come up through the trade unions, had to sit in a house nearby for a fortnight waiting for the event, and the two of them apparently got on rather well. The family had wanted to call her Anne. The king did not like it, so she was Margaret, and the second name was added because they liked the sound of the two together. 2 daughters then, 4 years apart, and a mother who adored them and who was also, for weeks and months at a stretch, on a ship. That was the deal, and every royal wife of the period made it, and hardly any of them wrote down how it felt. The children were left with grandparents and with Allah, while the parents did tours that could not be refused. Those photographs of reunions on station platforms are genuine, and so is the fact that the first daughter did not see her mother between the January and the June of that second winter. What she did do when she was there was be there. The two little girls came down to the drawing room in the mornings, and again before bed. There were games on the landing. She read to them herself. She taught them, as she had been taught, at a piano. The family were determined that the girls should have something recognisably like the childhood she had had at St. Paul's, Walden Bury. Dogs, gardens, jokes at the table, parents in the same room. Within the limits of the job, they very nearly managed it. And the elder of those two girls, watching how her mother did all of it, was taking notes she would use for the next 70 years. Now let us turn back a little to the thing that was destroying her husband. The season the nursery opened above them was also when he stopped refusing to be helped. Worst of it had happened in public, on the last day of October 1925, at the closing ceremony of the Empire exhibition at Wembley. He had to make a speech into a microphone in front of 100,000 people in the stadium and an unknown number listening at home on the wireless, which was still a novelty, and which had the effect of putting a man's voice into people's kitchens. He got through it, barely. There were pauses of 8 and 10 seconds where nothing came out at all, and the crowd stood in an agony of embarrassment, and everybody present understood that they were watching a man drown. His wife was in the stand. By then she had been married to him 2.5 years, and had by then watched perhaps 100 of these on a smaller scale, and she had also sat through the aftermath of them, which was the part nobody saw, the fury, the shame, the certainty that he was useless. He had been treated before, several times by several people with the standard methods of the day, and none of it had worked. And by 1925 he had decided that nothing would and had refused to see anybody else. That was a settled position, and it took her the best part of a year to move him off it. In the crowd at Wembley that afternoon was an Australian who had come to London 2 years before and set up rooms in Harley Street. Lionel Logue had no medical qualification of any kind. He had been an elocution teacher in Perth, had worked with shell-shocked soldiers returning from the war who had lost their speech, and had arrived at a set of ideas about breathing and confidence that the medical establishment regarded as quackery. He listened to the Duke of York on that platform and said afterwards, to somebody standing near him, that he could very nearly cure him. In October 1926, the Duke of York went to see him. He went because his wife had asked him to, repeatedly, and she went with him. Logue's first conclusion was that there was nothing organically wrong, no defect of the palate, nothing in the throat, no injury. What there was 3 decades of accumulated terror producing muscular spasm at the moment of speech, and a life spent constructing sentences to avoid consonants. The treatment was physical and dull. An hour of breathing exercises daily, tongue twisters, reading aloud, standing by an open window in a way that would have looked ridiculous to anybody who walked in, which is precisely why nobody was allowed to walk in. The exercises she did with him. That is the part which is not decoration. In Harley Street she sat in on the sessions. She did the exercises alongside him at home so that he was not a man being treated, but two people doing something together. And she supplied, over the next quarter of a century, the thing Logue could not prescribe, which was an audience of one who was not afraid of the silence when it came. Improvement came fast, months, not seasons, which was providential. On the 6th of January, the two of them boarded a battle cruiser at Portsmouth and sailed for the other side of the world. 6 months that tour: Jamaica, the Panama Canal, the Pacific, Fiji, New Zealand, then Australia. They travelled by ship and by train and by car. They were looked at by enormous crowds in every town, and the central event was the opening of the new Federal Parliament House in the brand new capital at Canberra on the 9th of May. Oh. He got up in the Senate chamber in front of the assembled members and 500 official guests, with thousands more in stands outside, and delivered his address. There was no stammer. He wrote to Logue from the ship about the smaller victory that had made it possible. The toast to the king had been the phrase he dreaded most in the language, the one he could never get out. He had taken to proposing it every evening at dinner on board, deliberately, and it had stopped frightening him. They landed in June. Waiting for them at the end of it were flags, cheering along the whole route in from the coast, and a small girl who had been 9 months old when they sailed and had not laid eyes on either of them since. She did not know who they were. They finally got their own house that year, and it is worth walking into it, because the 9 seasons the family spent there were the ones she looked back on for the rest of her life as the good ones. Number 145 Piccadilly stood at the Hyde Park corner end, one of a terrace of tall stone-fronted houses looking out over the traffic at the front and the green of the park behind. Large, in the way London houses of that class were large, 25 bedrooms, a lift, a ballroom nobody much used. And it was, this is the point, a house, not a palace, not a lodge in the middle of a park, not an apartment inside somebody else's establishment. It had a front door onto a public street, and a number instead of a name, and people walking past on the pavement could look up at the windows. Their nursery was at the top, under a glass dome, and along the landing outside it was a collection of toy horses on wheels, which the 2 girls kept in a line and groomed and fed and unsaddled every night before bed. That detail comes up in every account of the house by anybody who ever went into it, which tells you what the atmosphere of the place must have been. Downstairs was a boudoir at the front where the Duchess sat and wrote her letters, and where the girls came in the mornings. There were dogs. There was a great deal of coming and going of Bowes-Lyon relations, which was not usual in royal households, and which she simply imported wholesale from her own upbringing. And in 1931 the king gave them the second house, which turned out to be the one she loved most. Royal Lodge sits in Windsor Great Park, 3 miles from the castle, and when they were offered it, it was half derelict. Most of it had been pulled down a century earlier. What remained was a saloon of extraordinary proportions and a good deal of ruin, and it was painted, or had once been painted, a pale pink. They took it and spent the next 2 decades on it. He was the gardener. This is a genuinely surprising fact about George VI, and it was the great release of his life. He laid out the grounds himself, dug, cleared scrub, made a rhododendron garden that became famous, and worked in it in old clothes at every opportunity for the rest of his life. She did the inside. Pink it stayed. In the garden at Royal Lodge there was one more thing, which arrived in 1932 as a present from the people of Wales to the elder daughter on her 6th birthday. A house, a real one, thatched, with a working kitchen and a bathroom and electric light and beams, built to 2/3 scale for children, and it was called the Little House in Welsh, and the 2 girls kept it themselves, sweeping it and tidying it and being responsible for it. That is the texture of the decade. Ponies, the garden, Piccadilly in the week and Windsor at the weekend, Scotland in the late summer, Sandringham at Christmas. Lessons with a Scottish governess who arrived in 1932 and stayed for 16. A father who came up to the nursery and got down on the floor, and who was easier at home than he was anywhere else in the world, and a mother who ran the whole household on the principle her own mother had run one on, which was that the children were the point and not an interruption. Something else in those years, quieter and more consequential. The old king became devoted to her. George V was not a man who liked people. He terrified his sons. He had never learned how to be affectionate to anybody, and his court was famous for its rigidity. He adored his second son's wife without qualification from the beginning, and he let her get away with things nobody else on earth could have attempted, including arriving late for meals, which was in that household roughly equivalent to arson. He adored the elder granddaughter too. There is a well-known scene of the King of England on his hands and knees on the floor, being a horse for a small girl who is leading him along by the beard. And in 1935, at his Silver Jubilee, riding through streets packed with the poorest people of London cheering him, he said the thing that everybody remembers about him, which was that he could not understand it, because he was only a very ordinary sort of fellow. He was 70, and he was very ill, and he was frightened about what would happen after him. He said as much more than once, to more than one person. His fear was not about the second son. His fear was about the first one, and it was entirely specific, and events proved him right within 11 months of his death. He died at Sandringham on the 20th of January 1936, in the house he liked best, in a small bedroom on the first floor, at 5 minutes to midnight. His going was quicker at the end than it might have been. His physician, a man of enormous eminence, gave him an injection that night which brought the death on, and the reason he wrote down in his own notes, long afterwards, so that the announcement could go into the morning papers rather than the evening ones. That fact did not come out for another half-century. Whatever else is true of it, the family were not told, and the sons who were standing in that house had no idea. George V had been failing for a year. What he had said in the months before, to more than one person, was that his eldest son would ruin himself within 12 months of taking the throne, and that he prayed nothing would come between his second son and the throne after that. Those are not the words of a man idly worrying. He knew his eldest son extremely well, and had known about the American woman for a considerable time. Edward VIII was 41 on his accession, and was, on paper, the most brilliantly equipped monarch Britain had ever produced. He had toured the empire for 15 years. He was recognizable by face to hundreds of millions of people. He was slight and fair, and had a genuine, unfakeable ability to interest himself in the men in a factory yard, and he had gone into the mining valleys during the Depression and said things that no member of his family had ever said, and the country was fond of him in a way that it had never been fond of his father. He had also, for 2 winters by then, been in a relationship with a married American woman called Wallis Simpson, and everybody at the top of British life knew about it, and not one word of it had appeared in a British newspaper. That silence is genuinely difficult to imagine now. The American press had been running the story for months, and copies of American magazines arriving in Britain had the relevant pages cut out of them before they reached the shops. Continental papers carried it. Papers at home, by an unspoken agreement among the proprietors, did not, and the ordinary reader in Britain learned that anything was happening only at the very end. Inside the family, of course, it had been the only subject in that house for 2 years. Her own position on it went through 3 stages, and I want to be accurate about them, because the version that has come down is a caricature. At first she was friendly. There is a visitor's book at Fort Belvedere, the house near Windsor that Edward had made his own, with her name in it. She went to dinners there. She was perfectly pleasant to Mrs. Simpson, in the way she was perfectly pleasant to everybody, and there is no evidence of hostility at the start at all. Then came coolness, and the coolness was not moral outrage about divorce, whatever was said afterwards. It was closer to protectiveness of a family, plus a highly developed sense of who was being made ridiculous. Before her was a man in his 40s, her husband's elder brother and now the king, becoming entirely absorbed in the wishes of one person, and she watched the effect on the machinery around him. The papers not read, the boxes left unopened for days, the ministers kept waiting, the courtiers resigning, and then there was the third stage, and the third stage lasted the rest of her life, which was well over 60 more years. The thing that turned it was not the marriage, it was the summer of 1936, and specifically it was Scotland, and what happened at Balmoral in the September of that year is the hinge on which the whole of the rest of this story swings. But before Scotland there was the cruise, and the cruise is where the outside world came in. In August, Edward hired a steam yacht called the Narlin, and took a party of friends down the Adriatic coast. Mrs. Simpson was with him, but they went ashore in Yugoslavia and Greece and Turkey, and they were photographed constantly, and the King of England was photographed in shorts, and in one picture in bathing trunks, and in a great many pictures with a woman who was visibly the centre of his attention. Those photographs went round the world. They appeared on the front pages in New York and Paris and Berlin. They did not appear in Britain, but the British ruling class saw them, and so did everybody who travelled, and the mood in London when the party came home in September had changed from private embarrassment to something much closer to alarm. Then he went north for the shooting, and he took her with him, and he put her in the house that his father and his grandfather had used, and he asked her to act as hostess in it. Balmoral is a house with an atmosphere, and the atmosphere had been set by Queen Victoria and had barely been altered since. Tartan carpets, antlers, cold rooms, a rigid daily timetable of shooting, walking, tea, dressing, dinner, and a set of household rules that had the force of scripture, because nobody had ever thought to question them. That was the establishment Edward VIII arrived at in September 1936, and he had already announced that he intended to reform it. He had begun at Sandringham in the winter, dismissing staff and cutting wages, in a house full of men who had worked there 4 decades, and whose fathers had worked there before them. He had done it briskly and without much consultation, and the Duke of York, whose own household it partly overlapped with, had found himself picking up the pieces. Now in Scotland 2 things happened within days of each other. First, Aberdeen. A new hospital wing was to be opened in the city, and the king had been asked, months earlier, to do it, and he had declined on the grounds that the court was still in mourning for his father. That was a perfectly reasonable answer, and it was accepted, and the Duke and Duchess of York were asked to go instead. On the day, the Duke and Duchess drove into Aberdeen and opened the hospital wing. And on the same day at Ballater Station, the King of England was photographed at the wheel of a car, in person, collecting Mrs. Simpson and her friends off the train. That photograph ran in the Aberdeen papers, side by side with the other one. A city that had been told the king was too deep in mourning to come read the 2 pictures in about 4 seconds, and the reaction in the northeast of Scotland was cold and did not thaw. The second thing happened inside the house, and there are several versions of it, and the versions differ in the details in the way that stories from that world always do. The Yorks came over to dinner at Balmoral. Mrs. Simpson, as hostess, moved forward at the door to receive them, and the Duchess walked straight past her without stopping, saying to nobody in particular that she had come to dine with the king. Whether the words were exactly those hardly matters. Something of that kind occurred, and everybody in the room understood it, and it was reported afterwards by more than one guest. It is the only recorded moment in 101 years in which Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was publicly and deliberately rude to another woman. Consider what was actually being asked of her in that doorway. She was being asked to be received in the King's Scottish house as a guest of a woman who was still married to somebody else and who occupied no position of any kind in a family whose entire claim on the loyalty of the country rested on being the one thing in national life that was not a scandal. She had spent 13 years working in every draughty town hall in Britain to build up exactly that. She was not going to curtsy to its opposite. There is another element, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. She was frightened. Because by the autumn of 1936 a possibility had opened up that had not existed before, and everybody in that family could see it, and the person it threatened most was the man she was married to. If Edward would not give the woman up, and if the government would not accept her, then there was only one way out, and at the end of that way stood her husband, who had a stammer that terrified him, who had never been trained for any of it, who had never seen a state paper, and who was not physically strong. Her marriage had been 13 years of building one nervous man into somebody who could function in public. She could see the whole of it about to be picked up and put in a furnace. In October, Mrs. Simpson's divorce was granted at Ipswich. In November, the King told the Prime Minister he intended to marry her and would go if he could not. A compromise was floated, in which he would marry her and she would not be Queen, and it was rejected by the Cabinet and by the governments of the Dominions. On the 3rd of December, the British newspapers finally broke their silence, all at once, and the country woke up to the whole thing at once. And the Duchess of York, at the centre of the largest constitutional crisis of the century, spent almost the entire week of it flat on her back at home with influenza and a high fever. His instrument of abdication was signed on the 10th of December, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, in the presence of his 3 brothers, who signed as witnesses. Signing took a matter of minutes. A short document, and the handwriting on it is perfectly steady. Next evening he broadcast to the country from Windsor Castle and told them he had found it impossible to carry the burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. Then he went down to Portsmouth in the dark and got on a destroyer and left England, and did not come back to live in it again. His brother had spent the previous day at Marlborough House with their mother, and what he did there, by his own account written down afterwards, break down and sob like a child. He said he had never wanted this to happen, that he had never seen a state paper, that he was entirely unprepared. Queen Mary sat with him. Queen Mary was not a demonstrative woman, and this was the one occasion in her life when she was. On the 11th of December he became King George VI. He took his father's name deliberately, in place of Albert, precisely to signal that nothing had changed and that the thing was still standing. His wife was Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, and she was 36, and she had not been out of bed for a week. I want to be exact about how she felt, because this is the part that everybody guesses at. She was not thrilled. There is no version of this in which she was thrilled, and the letters from that fortnight are unambiguous. She wrote of feeling completely overcome, of the whole thing being a great shock, of dreading what it would do to her husband. She had spent her 20s refusing to marry into this family precisely because she did not want a life of total public exposure, had eventually married the son who was not going to inherit, had built a private and extremely happy household on that basis, and had now been handed the thing she had twice said no to. Both little girls were told at Piccadilly. There is an account of the younger one, aged 6, asking her sister whether this meant she would have to be the next queen, and being told yes, and saying, "Poor you." Their move to Buckingham Palace came in February. She hated it and never stopped hating it. She described it as an icebox and complained that you could not find anybody in it. The family had come from a house with a front door on a street, and they went to a building with 600 rooms where the private apartments were a long way from anything, where the corridors were cold, and where the 2 girls could not simply go out into a garden without a procession. And now to the part that lasted. The Duke of Windsor married Wallis Simpson in France in June 1937. No member of the royal family attended. That was decided in London, and the king was persuaded to it by his advisers, and it was probably inevitable. What was not inevitable was the other decision made by letters patent in May of that year, which confirmed that he remained a royal highness, but that his wife and any children would not be. That was a wound that never healed for the rest of both of their lives, and the Duke of Windsor believed to his dying day that his sister-in-law was behind it. Certainly she was in favour of it. The evidence for her actually engineering it is thin, and the king himself had strong views, and so did the government. But she never argued against it either, and she never softened afterwards, not by an inch, not in 65 years. When the Duke of Windsor died in 1972, she was gracious to his widow in public, and the two women spoke, and that was the extent of it. Her reason, when she gave one, was always the same, and it was never about morals. It was that her husband had been given a job that killed him. That is a hard sentence, and she believed it flatly, and after 1952 she believed it with a particular fixity. Whether it is fair is another question. What is not in doubt is that she held it, without wavering, for the second half of a very long life. Their coronation was held on the 12th of May, 1937, which was the date that had already been fixed for the coronation of the other brother. Nobody moved it. The invitations had gone out. The stands were built. The foreign delegations had booked, and it was decided that the simplest and most reassuring thing to do was to hold the ceremony on the appointed day with a different pair of people in the middle of it, which tells you the whole strategy of that reign in one decision. Continuity. Nothing to see. The show goes on. London filled up for a week beforehand. Stands ran the whole length of the route, and people slept out on the pavement for 2 nights in the rain to hold a place, and the crowds on the day were estimated at 1.5 million. This was the first coronation to be broadcast, and something like 60 million people around the world listened to it on the wireless. Cameras were allowed to film the procession, and, for the first time, part of the service inside the Abbey. She left the palace in the Gold State coach, which is a vehicle of extraordinary discomfort, and the route went by way of the Mall and Trafalgar Square and Whitehall, and took the best part of an hour. Inside the Abbey the 2 princesses were there in the royal gallery, aged 11 and 6, in white dresses and purple robes and little gilt coronets, and the younger one was rather too short to see over the edge and had to be given something to stand on. Queen Mary came, which no dowager queen had done before, on the reasonable grounds that after the year the family had just had, the sight of the old king's widow in the Abbey was worth more than precedent. Her gown was by Hartnell, in white satin, embroidered with the emblems of the nations and of the dominions in gold and silver thread, and over it a purple velvet robe with a train of 6 yards carried by 6 maids of honour. Her crown had been made new for her in platinum, and set into the front of it was the Koh-i-Noor diamond. That service is very long and very old. A queen consort sequence comes after the king's and is simpler. She is anointed, she is given a ring and a rod and a sceptre, and she is crowned. At the moment of her crowning, the peeresses in the Abbey put on their own coronets, all at once, several hundred pairs of white arms going up together. Everybody who saw it described that afterwards as the most beautiful thing in the day. That day was, in the way of these things, a series of small disasters that nobody outside noticed. One of the bishops assisting the king put his thumb over the words on the page at the exact moment the king needed to read them. Another one trod on his robe and had to be got off it. A chaplain fainted. The dean and the archbishop between them managed to present the crown the wrong way round for a moment before it was corrected. The king wrote it all down afterwards, dryly, in a private account, which is one of the more likeable documents of the 20th century, because the man who wrote it had been terrified for months, and clearly enjoyed himself once it started. And she did what she did, which was to be looked at by an enormous number of people and to appear entirely delighted to be there. That is the whole art of it, and it is worth stopping on, because the coronation of 1937 was a rescue operation dressed as a ceremony. 5 months earlier, the monarchy had been in a genuine crisis, with a king who had walked out and a successor almost nobody in the country could pick out of a crowd. What the institution needed, urgently, was to look permanent, unembarrassed and warm. It got a nervous man with a stammer who got through the whole 4-hour service without a stumble, 2 children in the gallery, an old queen in the seats, and a 36-year-old woman under a crown of platinum who smiled at the crowd from the balcony for so long that afternoon that the newsreels ran out of the film. Now, somewhere in that spring she also acquired the last piece of the public identity, which was the way she looked. Norman Hartnell was a London dressmaker who had built his business on society weddings and theatrical work, and it had been designing for her a season or 2 when the reign began. Then her husband did something unexpected. He took Hartnell round the picture galleries at Buckingham Palace and showed him the Winterhalter portraits, the great state paintings of the 1840s and 50s, the empresses and the queens of the last century, all vast skirts and bare shoulders and tulle. That, he indicated, was what he wanted his wife to look like. A curious instruction that in 1937, because the fashionable line of that decade was narrow, bias-cut, sleek, and long. What the king was asking for was a century out of date. Hartnell, who was clever, understood immediately what was really being asked, which was not a fashion question at all. Nobody wants their queen to look like everybody else's wife. They want her to look like a queen, and a queen at that date meant crinolines and jewels and a silhouette borrowed from paintings. So the wide skirt came in, and the embroidery, and the pale colours and the pearls, and it suited her. She was 5'2" and no longer slender, and the narrow line of the 30s would have been unkind, and the huge skirt with a tight waist was flattering and gave her presence in a crowd. Ostrich feathers, fur, a parasol in summer, which she used for the rest of her life, because a parasol keeps the sun out of your eyes and much more importantly means the crowd can see your face. Every part of it was practical, and it hardened into a style she then wore, essentially unchanged, for the rest of her life, until it stopped being a style at all and became simply what she looked like. And then, in June 1938, the thing that made all of it matter. She was due in Paris. A state visit had been arranged for the end of the month, and it was the first foreign visit of the reign, and it was not decorative. Europe in the summer of 1938 was 3 months from Munich. Austria had been annexed in March. The point of the visit was to stand in front of the French and be photographed being friendly, and the phrase everybody used about it was the Entente, and the substance underneath the phrase was that both countries were about to need each other very badly. 5 days before they were due to sail, her mother died. Cecilia Bowes-Lyon was 75. She had raised 10 children, buried 2 of them, run a hospital in her own dining room, gone under after Luce, come back for a wedding, and had lived long enough to see the 9th of her children crowned in Westminster Abbey. Her youngest daughter had written to her every week for as long as she had been able to hold a pen. Court mourning was declared. Paris was postponed by 3 weeks, and 30 new dresses in pastels and florals, finished and fitted and hanging in the workroom, became instantly unusable, because a woman in the first weeks of mourning for her mother does not step onto a quay in Paris in lilac. Black was the alternative, and black was impossible. This was July, in France, at a moment when the entire purpose of the exercise was to look like a country with its nerve intact. You do not arrive to reassure an ally dressed for a funeral. Hartnell went and looked it up, and came back with the answer, which was that white had been an accepted colour of royal mourning for centuries. Medieval queens of France had worn it. Queen Victoria had been buried in it. He then remade the entire wardrobe in white in under 3 weeks, all of it. Day dresses, evening gowns, a crinoline for the state banquet, coats, hats, everything, in silk and chiffon and lace and tulle with pearls. She left Dover in black and arrived in France in white, and the effect was one of the great public performances of the century. Paris, which is not a city that hands out compliments to English visitors, lost its head completely. There were crowds along the Champs-Élysées, a banquet at the Elysée, an evening at the Opera, a garden party in the Bois de Boulogne, a lunch at Versailles, a boat on the Seine. The autumn collection shown in Paris that year came out full of crinolines. On the final day, they went out to the Somme, to Villas Bretonneux, and unveiled a memorial to the Australians who had died in France, and laid flowers on it. That day she was a woman in mourning white, standing at a war memorial in the country where her brother was buried in a grave nobody could find, and she did not mention it, and she never did. Before we go on to the war, there is one more thread in the 1930s and 40s that belongs to her alone, and it is the one subject on which she was never anything but frank. She liked jewellery, not in a vague decorative way. She liked stones specifically, and she knew about them, and when she came into a great many of them in middle age, she wrote about it with an undisguised delight. That is one of the more endearing things in her correspondence. Start with what came with the job, because that is where the history gets uncomfortable. At the coronation she was crowned with a new crown made for her in platinum, and set into the cross at the front of it was the Koh-i-Noor. That diamond has one of the most contested histories of any object on earth. It came out of the ground in India centuries ago, passed through the hands of Persian and Afghan and Sikh rulers, and arrived in Britain in 1849 after the annexation of the Punjab, having been signed over by a boy of 10 who had inherited a kingdom the East India Company was in the process of taking apart. It was recut for Queen Victoria, losing a great deal of its weight, and, most jewellers think, a good deal of its fire. There is an old superstition attached to it that it brings misfortune to a man who wears it, which is why it has only ever been set in the crowns of queens. India, Pakistan, Iran and Afghanistan have all at various times asked for it back. It sat on her head on the 12th of May, 1937, and it sat on top of her coffin 65 years later, and it is in the Tower of London now, and this argument about where it ought to be has not finished. Then there was the other kind of jewellery, the kind that is a working tool. She wore pearls constantly, 3 or 4 rows of them, close at the throat, and she wore them for the same practical reason she wore pale coats. Pearls reflect light upwards onto a face, which is useful when your face is the thing several thousand people have come to look at in a northern country on an overcast afternoon. She had brooches for regiments and brooches for countries and brooches given to her by cities she had visited, and she wore the right one to the right place, every time, for 6 decades, because somebody in the crowd always noticed and it always mattered to them. And then, in the middle of the war, a woman she had known 2 decades died and left her the lot. Margaret Greville was the illegitimate daughter of an enormously rich Scottish brewer, and she had married into the aristocracy, and after her husband died young, she spent the following 3 decades being one of the great hostesses of Europe. Polesden Lacey, the house in Surrey where the Yorks had spent the first part of their honeymoon in 1923, was hers. She was sharp-tongued, snobbish, extremely generous, politically unwise in the 1930s in ways that have not aged well, and genuinely fond of Elizabeth, who was fond of her back. Dying in September 1942, she left her entire collection of jewels with her loving thoughts to the Queen. There were something over 60 pieces. Emerald necklaces, a diamond tiara of the 18th century Russian style, ruby and diamond pieces by the great Paris houses, bracelets. When the newspapers got hold of the will, the following January they printed the value of the estate, and it was more than £1.5 million at wartime prices, in the middle of a war, in a country living on powdered egg. She wrote to her mother-in-law about it, and did not pretend to be anything other than thrilled. She said she admired beautiful stones with all her heart. Queen Mary, who was the greatest collector of jewels in the family, and had never been left anything by anybody, wrote back to say that she understood the pleasure entirely, and was not really jealous, which from Queen Mary is a joke of considerable dryness. Those pieces are still in the family. They come out at state banquets now, on a generation that had not been born when the black tin trunk arrived at Buckingham Palace, and the women who wear them are wearing, whether they think about it or not, the estate of a Scottish brewer's daughter who liked a queen. Next spring they went to Canada, and this is the tour that changed everything, and it is the one that almost nobody in Britain remembers. They sailed in May 1939, and the first thing that happened was 3 days of fog. The ship crossed into an ice field somewhere south of Newfoundland and had to stop, and sat still in freezing white blankness with icebergs around it, engines quiet, foghorn going for the better part of 2 days. She wrote a letter to her elder daughter from the middle of it, describing the icebergs, and it is a delighted letter. 27 years after the Titanic, sitting in a stopped ship in an ice field, this woman was writing home to a girl of 13 about how beautiful it was. They landed at Quebec on the 17th of May, and it was the first time a reigning British monarch had ever set foot in Canada. Then they crossed the country and came back 6 weeks by train. Ottawa, Toronto, Winnipeg, Regina, Calgary, the Rockies, Vancouver, Victoria, and back the other way. Their train stopped in places with 100 people at the halt and places with 500,000 in the streets. In Winnipeg, the crowds were so heavy that the schedule collapsed. In Quebec, the king spoke in French, and the province, which had been expected to be cool, was not. And in Ottawa there was a moment that the Canadian officials talked about long afterwards. A ceremony had been arranged at a war memorial, with several thousand veterans of the last war standing in ranks around it, and after the wreath was laid, she said she wanted to go into the crowd. Her security people were appalled. She went anyway, and the king went with her, and the two of them walked into a mass of 10,000 old soldiers with no barrier of any kind, and were surrounded, and were entirely safe, and the veterans opened and closed around them like water. Not that a queen had never been polite to a crowd before. What startled people was that no one had ever walked in among them like that, deliberately, without a rope. Here was the birth of a technique that is now completely standard, and that at the time struck everybody who saw it as astonishing. They went on to the United States in June, which was the harder half. America in 1939 was strongly isolationist. There were many millions of Irish Americans and German Americans with no reason to be sentimental about the British Crown, and there was a firm national position that Europe's next war was going to be Europe's. Nobody was expecting the visit to change that, and it did not change it. What it did was something smaller, and as it turned out, more useful. They were driven through Washington in 90-degree heat with 750,000 people on the streets. They went to New York and to the World's Fair, and then President Roosevelt took them to his own family house at Hyde Park in the Hudson Valley and gave them, on the Sunday, a picnic. At the picnic, he served hot dogs. This became instantly the most famous thing about the entire tour, and it was on the front page of every newspaper in the United States. Beforehand, there had been some fuss about whether it counted as an insult. The king ate too. The Queen, so the story goes, asked how one was supposed to manage it, and was told to put it in her mouth and keep pushing, which is a good line and may even be true. What was really going on that weekend was happening in the evenings, when Roosevelt and the King sat up talking, alone, about ships and convoys and the Atlantic and what the United States might be able to do for a country at war without technically being at war. Roosevelt took a liking to him. That mattered enormously within 3 years. They came home at the end of June to the largest crowds of their lives. Something had shifted in the reign. The man who had come to the throne 2.5 years before as the substitute, the stammerer, the one nobody had chosen, had crossed a continent and been cheered by millions of people, and had done it as himself. They had 9 weeks. War was declared on the 3rd of September, 1939, at 11:15 in the morning, and the King broadcast to the Empire that evening at 6. He had been preparing for days. Logue was in the room with him at Buckingham Palace, as Logue would be for every major broadcast of the war, and the two of them went through the text, taking out the words that were going to be difficult and putting in easier ones. There is a photograph of the King at the microphone in naval uniform, and he got through it, and it was one of the best things he ever did, and his wife was in the building. Then the question was where the family would go, and the answer to that question is the reason the rest of this chapter matters. The suggestion, made seriously and repeatedly at the start, was Canada. There was precedent for it in other countries, and it was not cowardice. Royal families and governments across Europe went into exile in 1940, and were right to, and there was a real argument that the king and queen of a country facing invasion should be somewhere they could not be captured or killed. The Dutch royal family came to Britain. So did the Norwegian king. When the invasion of Britain looked genuinely imminent, plans existed for the family to be moved to houses in the west of England and, if necessary, across the Atlantic. She refused, and she refused in a form of words that went round the world and has been quoted ever since. The children would not go without her, and she would not go without the king, and the king would never go. The two girls went to Windsor Castle, 13 and 9, and stayed there for most of the next 5 years, which was itself kept secret at the time, and reported only as somewhere in the country. The parents worked in London and slept at Windsor most nights, driving down in the dark with the headlights masked. And she began to prepare for something that sounds faintly ludicrous now, and was not remotely ludicrous in the summer of 1940. She learned to shoot. She practiced with a revolver in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, and there is testimony from more than one person who watched her do it. Asked about it, she said she would not go down without a fight. A company of Coldstream Guards was billeted around the palace with instructions for what to do if German parachutists came down in the park, and there was a plan, and there were bags packed, and the plan was real because in that June an invasion was a straightforward operational expectation, and not a hypothetical. She was 39. She was the queen of a country that had just lost its army's equipment on a beach in France, that had no allies left standing in Europe, and that was expecting to be invaded within weeks. First thing she did with it was write letters. Hundreds, thousands of them, over the 6 years that followed. To bereaved families, to men in hospitals, to the wives of servicemen, in her own hand, unprompted, and often to people nobody would have expected her to notice. The second thing she did was broadcast. In the November of 1939, she spoke on the wireless to the women of the Empire, and it was the first time a queen consort had ever addressed the country directly like that, and it was pitched precisely at the women who were doing the work. The ones running households without men, the ones already receiving telegrams. She did another one, in French, to the women of France, before France fell. In August 1940, she made a third to the women of the United States. The third thing was the one that took the most out of her, and it was the visits, the factories, the hospitals, the bombed-out streets, the shipyards, the canteens, the shelters, week after week for the duration. And somewhere early on, in Berlin, Somebody in the German propaganda service was reported to have described her as the most dangerous woman in Europe. The line is usually attributed to Hitler, and there is no reliable source for it, and it has been repeated ever since because it captures something that was true. Dangerous, not because of anything she decided. She was dangerous because she was extremely good at making people who had lost their houses feel that the country had noticed. Then, in September 1940, the bombers came for London, and the whole question of where the royal family were standing became a great deal less abstract. London's Blitz began on the 7th of September, in the late afternoon of a Saturday, when 350 bombers came up the Thames estuary and attacked the docks. The docks are in the East End, and the East End is where the dockers lived, in tight streets of small terraced houses packed right up against the wharves, which meant that a raid aimed at the shipping was, unavoidably, a raid on a residential district. That first night, the fires in the Surrey docks were visible for 30 miles. The bombers came back the next night, and the night after that, and then every night for 57 consecutive nights. By the end of the first week, there were tens of thousands of people in the East End with nowhere to sleep. Rest centres, schools, church halls, the underground platforms. And there was real anger in those streets, because the bombs were falling on Silvertown and Poplar and West Ham and not on Mayfair, and the people in those boroughs said so out loud. The King and Queen went in on the second day, and kept going in. She was heckled on one of those early visits. This is not in most accounts, and it should be, because it makes what came afterwards mean something. A woman in a bombed street shouted at her, and the substance of it was that it was easy for people in palaces. Her response was not a speech. It was simply that she came back the following week, and the week after that. And then, on the 13th of September, 6 days into the Blitz, a German aircraft came up the Mall in the rain at low level and put a stick of bombs directly into Buckingham Palace. They were both in the building. They were in a small sitting room on the first floor with a private secretary, and one of the bombs exploded in the quadrangle perhaps 80 feet away, and the windows blew in over them. Nobody in the room was hurt. A workman in the palace was killed. The chapel was destroyed. That was the second strike on the building in 3 days, and there would be 9 in all. The aircraft, they were both convinced, had flown up the Mall deliberately in cloud low enough to see what it was aiming at. What she said afterwards is the most famous sentence of her life. She said she was glad they had been bombed, because now she could look the East End in the face. That line did more work for the British monarchy than any other 9 words of the 20th century, and it is worth being clear-eyed about why. It was not because the royal family had suffered comparably. They had not, and she knew it, and the sentence does not claim it. What the sentence does is smaller and cleverer. It concedes the point that had been shouted at her in the street. It accepts that there had been a gap. And then it says the gap has closed, not because ordinary people had been elevated, but because the bombs had come to the palace too. It also happened to be true. They were in the building. They stayed in London, in that building, throughout. And although they slept at Windsor a good deal, they were in London by day for the entire war, and the palace was hit 9 times. And the staff went down into a basement shelter with everybody else. The visits went on. Coventry after the November raid, walking through a city centre that had ceased to exist. The docks, Southampton, Bristol, Plymouth, Sheffield, Glasgow, Belfast. Newsreel of those visits survives, and what is striking is the absence of anything resembling a barrier. She walks along the front of a queue of women waiting for water, in a hat, in gloves, in ordinary shoes, over rubble, and talks to them one at a time. Her clothes during those visits were a deliberate decision that has been misread ever since. She refused to wear anything drab, powder blue, dusty pink, lilac. She said, when it was queried, that they would be wearing their best if they were coming to see her, and that a person standing in the ruins of their own house wanted something to look at that was not grey. Whether that was the right judgment people can decide for themselves. What is not in dispute is that in a city where the entire visual field had gone the colour of ash and brick dust, they could see her coming from a long way off, which was the point. The middle of a war is the part nobody writes about, because the middle of a war is not a series of events. It is a long grey continuation in which the food gets worse and the news comes in and everybody is tired. Windsor Castle by then was not a palace so much as a large cold building with the pictures taken down. The great chandeliers were dismantled and put away. The valuables went into the vaults and to a quarry in Wales. Windows were bricked or boarded. Rooms were shut. State apartments went under dust sheets. The lawns were dug for vegetables, and the two princesses lived in a corner of it with their governess and Allah, doing lessons, keeping ponies, running a girl guide company that included evacuee children, and sleeping when the sirens went in a reinforced shelter in the dungeons. The palace kept the ration books. This has been sneered at as a gesture, and it was a gesture, but the household genuinely ate rationed food, and visiting Americans wrote home about the thinness of the meals and the line painted in the baths to mark 5 inches of water. Eleanor Roosevelt came to stay in the autumn of 1942 and slept in a room with a blown-out window boarded over, and ate what everybody ate, and wrote about it afterwards with obvious respect. The king aged extraordinarily fast. He was in his 40s, and he looked far older by the end of it. He smoked heavily, as almost every man of his generation did, and he worked without a break, and he was carrying the war in a way that showed in his face by 1943. And she carried him. That is what she did throughout, and it is the least visible thing in this entire story. He came home from days that had contained real horror and real fear, and the household ran on the assumption that whatever else happened, the atmosphere in the rooms where he was would be steady. She kept people talking at dinner. She kept the girls' lives ordinary. She kept the tempers manageable, and there were tempers, and the staff of that period all say the same thing, which is that the mood of the household was set by her. In August 1942, the king's younger brother was killed. The Duke of Kent, who was 39 and the most glamorous of the 4 brothers, and had a small son, a few weeks old, was flying to Iceland on a service flight when his aircraft came down on a hillside in Caithness in bad weather. Everybody aboard but one man died. It was the first death of a member of the royal family on active service in 4 centuries. His brother the king went up to Scotland for the funeral, and then to the crash site. Nothing survives on the record about how his wife handled that fortnight, which is entirely in keeping. The tide turned somewhere in the following year, and you can see it in the diaries. The raids thinning out, the news from Africa, then Italy, then in the Americans everywhere in the English countryside. The king went out to North Africa in the summer of 1943, and to Italy in 1944, flying, which she disliked intensely, and there is a letter she wrote to him while he was over the Mediterranean that is about as close to undisguised fear as her correspondence ever gets. The elder daughter grew up in that castle. She was 13 when the war started and grown by its end, and this entire adolescence happened inside it. At 16 she registered at the Labour Exchange like every other girl of her age. At 18 she was made a Councillor of State, and at last, over the objections of her father, and after a good deal of persistence, she was allowed to join the Auxiliary Territorial Service, where she learned to drive lorries and to strip and rebuild an engine, and where she was, for a few weeks, one of a large number of young women in overalls. And somewhere in that castle, in those years, a tall, fair naval officer who was her 3rd cousin began appearing at Christmas, and the family noticed her face when he did, Philip of Greece had first properly registered with her in 1939 at Dartmouth, but when she was 13, he spent parts of his leave at Windsor during the war. Her mother, watching all this with an experienced eye, did not think much of it at first. He had no money at all, a family scattered across Europe by revolution and exile, sisters married into Germany, and a manner that was blunt to the point of rudeness in a household that ran on tact. She came round. It took about 4 years, and the persuading was largely done by her daughter, who had inherited the quality that runs straight down this family, which is that when they decide something, they do not undecide it. In the February of 1947, the 4 of them went to Africa, and it was the last journey the family made together, and almost nothing about it went the way it was meant to. They sailed from Portsmouth in a new battleship on the last day of January. Behind them, Britain came apart in the weather. That winter was the worst of the century. Snow from the end of January to the middle of March, drifts 20 feet deep in places, coal frozen solid at the pit heads and unable to be moved, power stations shutting down, factories closing, electricity cut for hours a day, and 2 million people out of work by the middle of February because there was no power to work with. The king wanted to come home. He said so, repeatedly, by telegram, and was told by the government that going out to South Africa had been a considered decision, and that coming back early would look like panic. So he stayed in the sunshine, and he was miserable about it, and he lost 17 pounds in weight over those 3 months. The purpose of the tour was to hold South Africa inside the Commonwealth. The Prime Minister there, Jan Smuts, had been a Boer general fighting the British at the beginning of the century, and was by then an elder statesman of the empire he had fought, and he was facing an election he was going to lose. The country the family were driven through was already segregated in law, and about to become far more so. Within a year, Smuts was out, and the new government began building the system that took another 46 years to dismantle. None of that could be said aloud by any of them at the time, and none of it was what could be done, and what she did was refuse the small daily arrangements. A well-attested incident took place at one gathering where the crowd had been separated, and she went across to the side she had not been meant to go to and shook hands there. It changed nothing about the law of that country. Noticed it was, and reported, and it irritated the officials considerably, which was the point. They travelled in a white train, 14 coaches long, air-conditioned, with a mile of carriages carrying the household and the press, and they went 5,000 miles in it. The Cape, the Karoo, the Orange Free State, the Transvaal, Basutoland, Southern Rhodesia, the Victoria Falls. There were days of standing in temperatures over 100 degrees. The king's temper, worn thin by illness and by the news from home, went repeatedly. A story survives from that train of the sort that is usually left out of official accounts. He was in a black rage about something, and the household were braced, and his wife, according to a member of that household who was standing near enough to hear it, said something to him quietly that was not soothing at all. Funny, it was, and at his expense, and it broke the mood in about 4 seconds. That was how she did it. 24 years of practice. And then, on the 21st of April, in Cape Town, the elder daughter turned 21 and made a broadcast on the wireless to the entire Commonwealth. With the man who wrote it, she had worked over every line, insisting on the phrasing herself in places, and what she said was that her whole life, whether it be long or short, would be devoted to the service of the people. She was 21, on a warm autumn evening at the bottom of Africa, speaking into a microphone to a country 5,000 miles away that was frozen solid and had almost no coal. Her mother was in the room. Somewhere in that broadcast is the whole of what the previous 11 years had been for, and both of them knew it. They came home in May to a Britain that had thawed into floods. Victory in Europe was declared on the 8th of May, 1945, and the whole of London went out into the streets. 8 times that day the family went out onto the balcony. 8. Each time the mass of people below, stretching away down the Mall as far as anyone could see, let up a roar that those who stood in it described for the rest of their lives. Churchill came out with them once. Their father wore naval uniform. The Queen wore something pale and waved, and the 2 princesses stood between their parents in the uniforms of the services they had joined. And then, at some point in the evening, the 2 girls asked whether they might go out into it. Their father said yes. So the heir to the throne, aged 19, and her sister, aged 14, went out of a side door with a small group of young officers. They walked up Piccadilly and along Park Lane in the middle of an enormous drunken jubilant crowd. They went into the Ritz and out again, and did a conga line through the lobby. Then they came back down the Mall and stood outside the gates of their own house, shouting for the King and Queen to come out, and were entirely unrecognised. The elder one was in her ATS uniform and pulled her cap down over her eyes. They did it again on the following night. That story is usually told as a charming anecdote, and it is the clearest possible statement of what those 6 years had bought. The idea that the heir to the British throne could be in that crowd, at that moment in safety and in anonymity, tells you everything about where the monarchy stood in Britain in May 1945, and it is worth remembering how far from certain that had been in 1936. 2 months later, the country turned Churchill out of office in a landslide which shocked the king, and a Labour government came in with a programme of nationalisation and a new health service, and Britain went into 6 more years of rationing that were in some ways harder than the war. They had been back from Africa a matter of weeks when the other thing was settled. The engagement was announced in July, and her mother had by then made her peace with him completely, which had taken 4 years and a good deal of quiet persuading from the daughter. Taught? They were married in Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947. Consider what that day was practically. Britain was 2 winters into a peace that felt worse than the war. Bread had gone on the ration in peacetime, which it never had been while the bombs were falling. Meat, sugar, butter, clothing, petrol, coal, all rationed. There were bomb sites in every major city with weeds growing in them. Hartnell made the dress in ivory silk with 10,000 seed pearls on it, and the bride saved clothing coupons towards it, and was sent more by women all over the country who wanted to give her theirs, and every one of those had to be sent back because coupons were not transferable, and it would have been an offence to use them. The government declared the day a public holiday. 200 million people listened on the wireless. The crowds along the route stood in November cold and did not seem to mind. Presents arrived from all over the world, including from countries with very little to spare, and were put on public display, and a great many of them were things like knitted tea cozies and hand-embroidered handkerchiefs from women who had nothing else to send. Somewhere in the middle of that abbey, watching a daughter of 21 being married to a man with no money and a complicated family, was a woman who had walked up that same aisle at 22 and stopped by a black stone with her flowers. She had by then been a queen for 11 years and had another 55 to go. The following November there was a first grandchild, and the year after that a granddaughter, and there is a piece of newsreel of the Queen at Clarence House being handed a baby, and she is the same in it as she was with her own. And under all of it, through those first post-war winters, the king was ill. It began with cramp in his legs, and it was diagnosed as a serious circulatory disease that threatened his right leg with amputation. He had an operation on the nerves in his back, in March, at the palace. The silver wedding had been the previous year, and there is a photograph from it of a man who looks 2 decades older than his wife, though in fact he was 5 the other way. being 52 to her 47. He got better, and then he did not. In the spring of 1951, he had influenza that would not clear. In September, a growth was found in his left lung, and on the 23rd of that month, the whole lung was removed. Nobody used the word cancer to him, nor was it used in the bulletins. The public was told about a structural change in the lung, and the household was told rather more, and whether the king himself understood is a question people who were there answered differently for the rest of their lives. He was 56, and in the January of 1952, thin and grey and wrapped up against the cold, he stood on the tarmac at London Airport in the wind, bareheaded, and watched his daughter's aircraft take off for Kenya. One more episode belongs to the years just before the end, and that one shows you the hard edge of this family and of her. Marion Crawford was a Scottish schoolteacher of 22 when she came to the Yorks in 1932 to teach a girl of 6, and, in due course, her small sister. She was clever, she was cheerful, and she was hired partly because she walked everywhere and had strong opinions about children being taken out of doors. 16 years she stayed. She was there for Piccadilly and for the abdication, and she went to Windsor for the whole of the war, and she ran the Girl Guide Company in the grounds, and she took the girls on the underground once as an experiment in ordinary life, and she was the third adult of that childhood alongside the mother and the nurse. The children called her Crawfie. Crawfie stayed on beyond the point where she might reasonably have gone and married, and when she finally did marry, at 40, she was given a house in the grounds of Kensington Palace, and a decoration, and in 1949 an American magazine approached her. What happened next has been argued about ever since, and the facts that are not in dispute are these. She was in contact with the Queen about it. She was told, in writing, that no member of the household could publish about the family, and that anything of the kind would be a betrayal of the trust in her, and there appears to have been some suggestion at some stage that anonymous assistance to a writer might be a different matter. Then a series of articles appeared, in America and then in Britain, under her own name. They were serialized. Then they became a book. Published in 1950, it sold enormously. I have gone and looked at what is actually in it, because that is the part everybody gets wrong. No scandal in it of any kind. Nothing about the abdication that was not already known. No criticism of anybody. A warm, gushing, affectionate account of 2 little girls doing lessons and keeping ponies and lining up toy horses on a landing, written by a woman who plainly adored them both, and nothing more than that. It made no difference at all. The door shut, and it stayed shut for the remaining 38 years of Marion Crawford's life. She was moved out of the house at Kensington. No member of the family spoke to her or wrote to her again. When she died in 1988 in Aberdeen, no flowers were sent by anybody. Her name went into the language. For the next half-century, any servant of any household who talked was said to have done a Crawfie. The judgment on that is not mine to hand down, and people will make it differently. What is worth understanding is the reasoning behind it, because it was not personal spite, and it was entirely consistent with everything else in this story. She had been raised in a house where you did not discuss what hurt. She had watched a monarchy nearly go over in 1936 because a private matter became a public one. And she had spent the war believing, correctly, that the family's usefulness depended on being looked at without being examined. And she had held to one rule her whole adult life from that single conversation with a reporter in January 1923 onwards, which was that you do not talk. She applied that rule to herself for 79 of them without a single exception. Having done so, she was not going to make an allowance for anybody else, however loved, however long-serving, and however harmless the book turned out to be. It is the coldest thing in her life. It is also, if you follow the logic back, the same instinct that made her walk past a woman in a doorway at Balmoral and lay a bouquet on a stone without a word. He had 5 more days. They were at Sandringham, which was where the family always was at the end of January. The elder daughter and her husband were away, standing in for him on a tour that should have been his, and had reached Kenya, and was staying at a small hotel built into a fig tree above a waterhole in the forest. The king spent his last day out shooting hares on the estate at Sandringham. Cold and clear, that day he was in the field for most of it, and he was cheerful, and the bag was recorded in the book in the usual way. In the evening he had dinner with his wife and his younger daughter, and talked about the following day's shooting, and went up at about 10:30. A watchman in the grounds saw him at the window of his room, fixing the latch some time around midnight. He died in his sleep in the early hours of the 6th of February, 1952, of a coronary thrombosis. His valet found him at 7:30 in the morning. His wife was in the house. She was 51. His daughter in Kenya was told several hours later, in the middle of the afternoon there, by her husband, who took her out into the garden of the lodge to do it. She had gone up into the tree the night before as a princess, and had come down a queen, and nobody had known. Now I want to slow down here, because this is the point on which the second half of a very long life turns, and it is almost always skipped over in a sentence. 28 years married. She had married a man nobody expected anything of, and had spent nearly 3 decades making him into somebody who could do a job neither of them wanted, and she believed the job had killed him, and she had loved him. She was not old, nor was she ill. She had no function whatsoever. Throne, house, and the title Queen had all gone to her daughter in a single morning, and her own designation was now a piece of invented terminology, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, adopted partly to avoid confusion, and partly because there was no existing word for what she had become. She went to Scotland, to Birkhall on the Balmoral estate, and she stayed there, and for several months she was, by the account of everyone who saw her, entirely broken. That word is used deliberately. She did not appear in public. She did not answer letters. She said afterwards that she had come very close to disappearing altogether and simply staying in Scotland for good. What ended it, or began the ending of it, was 2 things. The first was a letter from Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister again, and who had known her 3 decades, and whose own history with grief and with black moods was long. He wrote to her about her husband, and about the country, and about what she still was to it. And she wrote back. The correspondence between those two over the following 13 years is one of the great sustained friendships in British public life, and it began in that spring. The second thing was a house. In the autumn of that year she was staying with friends on the far north coast of Scotland, in Caithness, which is about as far from London as it is possible to get on that island, flat, treeless, wind-scoured, with the Pentland Firth running past and the Orkney Islands on the horizon. Out on the coast road there was a 16th century castle called Barragill, empty, roofless in places, with the sea a few hundred yards away, and no shelter of any kind between it and the Arctic. Abandonment was days away. She bought it. She was told it was a folly, that nothing would grow, that the wind came over the wall at 90 miles an hour, and she bought it anyway, and gave it back its old name, the Castle of May. It has been said many times that she was buying a distraction. What she was actually doing, at 52, was buying the first building of her adult life that belonged to her and to nobody else. Not a grace and favour house, not a palace she had been put into, not a lodge in somebody's park. Her own front door, at the top of Scotland, with the weather coming straight off the sea. And there is one more thing about that particular stretch of coast which she certainly knew and never mentioned. 10 years before, her husband's younger brother had been killed when his aircraft came down on a hillside in Caithness, about 20 miles from the castle she had just bought. She came back in the autumn, and the thing she came back to had to be invented, because it did not exist. No precedent existed. Widowed queens in Britain had historically done one of two things. They had retired into deep and permanent mourning as Queen Victoria did for 4 decades, or they had gone quiet and dignified and largely invisible as Queen Alexandra did, and as Queen Mary was doing at that very moment in a house on the Mall. Nobody had ever taken the position and made something new out of it. She was 52, and she had another half-century in front of her, though of course she did not know that what she built was a separate court. That is the accurate description, and it is worth spelling out. She moved into Clarence House, next door to St. James's Palace, swapping houses with her daughter, and she spent nearly 50 of them in it. Royal Lodge at Windsor she kept, the family house since 1931. She kept Birkhall in Scotland. She acquired the castle in Caithness. And around all of it, she assembled a household of her own, with her own equerries and ladies-in-waiting and pages, running to a considerable number of people, and a diary of engagements that in her 70s still ran to 100 and more a year. Her mother-in-law died in the March of the following year, at 85, 6 weeks before her granddaughter's coronation, having left instructions that the coronation was not to be postponed on her account. Alas. And on the 2nd of June, 1953, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon sat in Westminster Abbey and watched her elder daughter, aged 27, crowned in the same building where she had laid down a bouquet 3 decades earlier as a bride, and where she had been crowned herself 16 years before that. She was in the gallery with the younger of her 2 grandchildren beside her, a boy of 4 in a white satin suit, who had to be lifted so that he could see, and who was Duke of Cornwall that morning, and would eventually inherit the whole apparatus. Film survives of it. She is watching her daughter and holding on to the child. Then came the half-century, and to understand what she actually did with it, you have to look at the daily texture rather than the events, because after 1952 the events largely stopped. The routine at Clarence House was established quickly and altered very little. She was not an early riser. Breakfast in bed, with the newspapers and letters. Her correspondence remained enormous to the end. She answered by hand at length in that fast downhill script, and she remembered anniversaries and illnesses and the names of the children of people who had worked for her decades earlier. There were engagements most days, regiments, hospitals, universities, colleges, launches, the University of London, of which she was Chancellor for 35 years, the Women's Institutes, the Royal College of Music, and something over 300 organisations at the peak that had her name at the top of their notepaper. There was lunch, which mattered, and dinner, which mattered more. Clarence House became known for a particular kind of evening. 8 or 10 people, extremely good food, extremely good wine, conversation that ran late, and a hostess in her 60s, and then her 70s, and then her 80s, who was invariably the last person still going. Writers she liked, and bishops, and soldiers, and anybody who could tell a story properly, and the atmosphere was, by every account, the least stiff of any royal household in the country, and underneath that, unmistakably, money. This is not a small footnote, and it is the standard criticism of her, made in her lifetime and made since. The household was enormous, and the overdraft at Coutts became a matter of periodic comment. She entertained on a scale that had gone out of fashion everywhere else in Britain by about 1960. She never once economised in any visible way. And the country, which had been on rations until 1954, on the whole, did not appear to mind, because the same public that will not tolerate extravagance from a politician will tolerate almost anything from a very old lady who reminds them of the war. Her staff stayed, which is the other measurable thing about that household. Pages, dressers, chauffeurs, chefs, ladies in waiting. People came to work for her in their 20s and were still there 4 decades later, and a good many of them retired out of it rather than left. She knew their families. She turned up at their weddings and their funerals. When one of them was ill, she went to the hospital, and not for a photograph, because there were no photographers. That is worth setting against the overdraft, because the two facts belong to the same woman, and neither cancels the other. She spent money on a scale that was indefensible by the standards of the country she lived in, and she was, to the people who actually worked in her houses, the best employer any of them ever had. Both things are true. Human beings are like that, and the ones who get written up as national treasures are no exception. And she was, this is less remarked, extremely shrewd about what she was for. Her elder daughter was the queen and had to be, in public, entirely neutral, entirely correct, and slightly remote. That is the job, and it is a job that leaves a gap. Somebody has to be the warm one. From 1952 onward, that was the mother, deliberately, and the two roles fitted together like a pair of hands. Come north with me now, because there is one place in all of this that she made entirely herself, and once a year for nearly half a century she went to it. The road up through Caithness runs out of trees somewhere south of Wick, and after that it is simply land, flat, wind-flattened, brown and green and grey, with stone dikes and the occasional farm and no shelter anywhere. Then you come along the coast road on the top edge of the mainland, with the sea on your right, and the water out there is the Pentland Firth, which is one of the fiercest stretches of tidal water in the world. And beyond it, low on the horizon, the Orkney Islands. The Castle of May stands in that landscape, about a mile from the shore, behind a high wall. When she bought it in 1952, it had been empty and was going to be abandoned. Parts of the roof were off, no electricity, and no water supply worth the name. Sheep had been in the lower rooms. The building itself is 16th century, a tall, high tower house of the sort that was put up all over Scotland when the country was dangerous, with thick walls and small windows and turrets at the corners, and its own long history of family quarrels ending badly. She spent 3 winters on it and paid for it herself, and she was closely and personally involved in the whole thing, down to the paint. What she made was not grand. That is the surprise of the place, and everybody who has been inside it says the same. The rooms are small and low and comfortable, chintz everywhere. The pictures are watercolours and family photographs rather than anything from a collection. Her sitting room looks out to the sea through a window in a wall 6 feet thick, and there is a chair, and the chair is angled to that view. Outside there is a walled garden, and the wall is 12 feet high on the seaside because it has to be. Nothing survives that wind unprotected. Inside it she grew vegetables and soft fruit and a great many roses, and the whole thing is divided by hedges into small compartments, each one a further windbreak, which is not decoration but engineering. She kept cattle, Aberdeen Angus, and then a herd of North Country Cheviot sheep, and she was serious about them. She showed at the local agricultural shows and won, and the winning mattered to her in a way that surprised people who thought the whole thing was a hobby. The pattern was fixed, and it did not vary. She went up in August for 3 weeks or so, and again in October for 10 days, every year, for 45 years. She flew or came by train and then drove out along the coast. The routine on arrival was always the same, and the local people knew it, and there was no ceremony to speak of. And this is the part that matters about May. In Caithness she was a neighbour. She went to the local shows and the local church. The farmers and the fishermen along that coast she knew by name and knew what had happened to their families. She went out on the shore. She had picnics in weather that would have kept most people indoors, And there are accounts of a woman in her 80s sitting on a rug in a gale, eating sandwiches with sand in them and refusing to move. One thing at May, she did every evening she was there. After dinner, when the light went, somebody would put on the wireless or a record, and there would be a drink, and the talk would go on, and at some point she would go and stand at the window and look out at the Firth in the dark, where the lights of the ships going through the channel move very slowly from left to right. She said more than once that she could not have got through the year after her husband died without that place. One more detail about that place, and it is the kind that tells you the whole character. When she was too old to make the journey easily, in her late 90s, she still went. And when she died, the castle did not go into the royal estate at all. She had already put it into a trust, some time earlier, with the express instruction that it should be open to the public. Now for the other great engine of that half-century, and it is not the one anybody expects. In 1949, 3 years before she was widowed, she and her elder daughter went to a house party and were persuaded by a friend at dinner to buy a steeplechaser between them. The horse was called Monaveen. He cost a little over £1,000, and he won at Fontwell that October, in colours the two women had chosen. And he went on to win 4 more races, and to run in the Grand National, in which he came 5th. That was the beginning of a 53-year obsession. She went into national hunt racing specifically, not the flat, which is where the royal family's racing interests had traditionally lain, and where her daughter's interests remained for life. Jump racing is a different world, rougher, colder, poorer, less fashionable, conducted on winter afternoons at small courses in the middle of nowhere in front of a few thousand people in wet coats. And she loved it entirely, without any hint of a pose. She had a commentary line installed so that she could listen to racing from wherever she was. She knew the form. She talked to trainers on the telephone constantly, and she visited the stables, and she went out to watch work in the mornings, in a headscarf, in the cold, and she knew every one of her horses by sight and by name and by temperament. She had close to 450 winners in all, and she had, in 1956, the most famous defeat in the history of British racing. The horse was Devon Lock, a 9-year-old, running in the Grand National Aintree with her colours up, and a former RAF pilot named Dick Francis in the saddle. Aintree is 4.5 miles and 30 jumps, and it is a brutal race, and Devon Lock had gone round it beautifully. He came over the last, with the race won. He was 5 lengths clear and going away, with 40 yards left, in front of an enormous crowd that was already roaring. And then, on the flat run-in, with nothing in front of him, he suddenly half-jumped at nothing, spread his hind legs, and went down flat on his belly on the turf. Nobody has ever explained it. Not the jockey, who spent the rest of his life being asked. Not the trainer. The theories are a ghost jump at the shadow of the water jump, a sudden noise from the crowd, a muscle spasm, a heart flutter. He got up unhurt within seconds and was perfectly fine, and another horse went past him and won the race, and the whole of Britain saw it happen. What she did in the next 60 seconds is the reason people still tell the story. She went straight down to the unsaddling enclosure, before anything else, to find the jockey and the stable staff, who were in a state that anybody who has ever cared about anything will recognise. Down she went, before the winners' connections had finished celebrating, and what she said, to a room of people who were devastated on her behalf, was that this is racing, and that they should all have a drink. She then sent presents to the stable lads. I have gone into this at some length because I think it is the single clearest window into what she was actually like, underneath the hats and the parasol and the wave. Here was a woman who had wanted that particular race the whole of her racing life, who had it in her hand and lost it in the strangest way it has ever been lost, in front of a national audience, and whose first instinct in the 90 seconds afterwards was to go and manage the feelings of the people who worked for her. That is not saintliness. It is a lifetime of training, begun in a dining room full of wounded men in 1915, running so deep by 1956 that it operated faster than her own disappointment. A racing day for her had a shape to it, and it is worth seeing, because it is the only part of her life in which she was consistently and openly not in control of the outcome. She went to the small meetings as well as the big ones: Sandown, Kempton, Ascot, Newbury, Fontwell, Cheltenham in March. She did not sit apart. She went down to the paddock and walked round with the trainer, looking at her own horse and everybody else's, in a headscarf and a good coat and sensible shoes, in the cold and the racing crowd, which is not a deferential crowd, and never has been made room for her, and got on with studying the form. Then the race. There are photographs of her watching, and the face in them is not the public face. The public face is switched off entirely. What is there instead is a woman of 80 with binoculars up, jaw set, entirely absorbed, wheeling an animal up a hill 4 furlongs away. And afterwards, win or lose, the same routine, down to the horse, hand on its neck, a word with the lad who does it, a word with the jockey, then home. She was still doing it in her 90s. There is a story from late on of a trainer telephoning Clarence House about a horse and being put through, and finding that she had already watched the race twice, knew exactly where it had gone wrong, and disagreed with him about it. Devon Lock never won the race. He never ran in another Grand National, and she went on putting horses in it and going to Aintree, and never won it for the next 46 years. The long stretch of her later life is difficult to write about, because very little happened in it, and it went on for a very long time, and yet the woman at the centre of it was becoming steadily more famous for existing. There were losses. Her brother David, the other of the 2 Benjamins, the one she had been inseparable from since the nursery at St. Paul's Walden Bury, died in 1961 at the age of 59, at Birkhall, while staying with her. Of the 10 children born at the beginning of the century, she was by then one of the last remaining, and she outlived every one of her brothers and sisters, the final one going in the mid-80s. There were operations, a fishbone lodged in her throat twice, which became a national news event on both occasions, and which she treated as an enormous joke, hip replacements in her 90s, cataracts, a broken hip at 98 from a fall at Sandringham, after which she was walking again within months, and she was filmed at 100 standing for the whole of a long ceremony in the sun. And there was the family, which by the 1980s had become complicated in public in ways that the institution had not experienced since her own arrival in it. I am not going to go through any of that here, partly because a good deal of it concerns people who are still alive, and it is not mine to characterize, and partly because it was very largely not her business. Her position through all of it was consistent, and it was old-fashioned. Whatever happened, it was not discussed outside the family, and the ones who were unhappy were welcome at Clarence House at any hour, and nothing was ever said in public by anybody. That what accumulated, decade by decade, with affection of a kind that is now essentially impossible to acquire. Part of it was longevity. By 1990, she was the last public figure in Britain who had stood in the bombed streets of the Blitz as a participant, and for a certain generation, the sight of her was the sight of their own childhood. Part of it was the manner, unchanged in 6 decades, the pale coats, the matching hat with the upturned brim, so that the face was visible, the gloves, the parasol in summer, the wave, which was small and unhurried, and went on slightly longer than you expected. And part of it was that she was, by the end, genuinely enjoying herself out there in a way that nobody else in that family has ever quite managed. Her 80th birthday, in 1980, brought a service in St. Paul's Cathedral. The 90th, in 1990, brought a parade on horse guards with 300 organisations. She was patron of represented in it, which took a long time to go past, and on the 4th of August, 2000, she turned 100. There was a telegram from her own daughter, which is a sentence that has almost certainly never been written about anybody else, and she went in an open carriage from Clarence House down the Mall with an escort, and there was a pageant on horse guards with camels in it, and a formation of aircraft overhead, including a Spitfire, a Hurricane, and a Lancaster. 40,000 people came into the Mall. She stood most of the time and declined to sit for a good deal longer than her family were comfortable with. Somebody watching from a window said afterwards that she looked exactly the same as she had at the Blitz, only smaller. A photograph survives from that summer of a woman of 100 outside the gates of Clarence House in pale blue, looking at a crowd of people who have queued to give her flowers. Set against the beginning of this story, that there's a very long way to have come. The girl in the window recess at Glamis with her feet up, invisible from the room, was born into a Britain of horses and gaslight and empire in the last summer of the 19th century, in a family with 9 surviving children and 4 sons who would go to a war that had not been thought of yet. She had outlasted all of it. The last winter was at Sandringham, as all her winters were. In the February, her younger daughter died. Margaret had been ill for a long time and had had a series of strokes, and was 57 when the illness began to take her in earnest, and 71 at the end. She died in a hospital in London on the 9th of February 2002. Her mother was 101 and was at Sandringham, and had recently fallen and cut her arm, and everybody around her assumed she would not travel. She travelled. She was flown down from Norfolk and driven to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, and she attended her daughter's funeral, in a wheelchair for part of it, with a veil, and she sat through the whole service. No photograph of her face during it has ever been published, and that is right. 7 more weeks she lived. She died at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park on the afternoon of the 30th of March 2002, in her sleep, in the house where her husband had made the garden, with her elder daughter at the bedside. She was 101 years and just under 8 months old. Her coffin was taken to Westminster Hall to lie in state for 3 days, and this is the part that surprised everybody, including the people who had organised it. They had expected a respectable turnout. What happened was that a queue formed along the Thames and did not stop forming. It ran back along the embankment and over Lambeth Bridge and down the far side of the river, and it kept going through the nights, and the hall was opened for 24 hours a day to cope with it, and something over 200,000 people walked past that coffin in 3 days. A great many of them were far too young to remember any of what she had done. They came anyway. On one of those nights her 4 grandsons came in and stood at the corners of the catafalque, in uniform, heads down, for 20 minutes, while the queue kept moving past them. The funeral was at Westminster Abbey on the 9th of April. 1 million people were on the streets. The coffin went in through the great west door, past the black marble slab where a young woman had once stopped and put down her flowers for a brother buried in a quarry in France, 79 years earlier, almost to the week. She was buried at St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beside her husband who had been waiting there half a century. Her younger daughter's ashes were placed there with them, and that is the whole of it. From a castle in Angus with the wind coming off the North Sea to a chapel at Windsor, by way of a hospital ward, a bouquet on a stone, an abdication nobody wanted, 9 bombs on a palace, and an ice field off Newfoundland, by way of a horse that fell down on the flat with the race won, and a small square house at the top of Scotland with the sea in the window. She never gave an interview. She never explained herself. Not once. In 101 years, did she say in public what she actually thought about any of the large things that happened to her? And almost everything we have of her interior life comes from letters she wrote to people she loved, in a hurry in a hand that ran downhill. What she left instead was a method. Look at the person in front of you. Ask the question and wait for the answer. Wear something they can see coming. Go back the following week when you have been shouted at. Do the difficult thing without announcing that you are doing it, and then never mention it again. Not a philosophy, and she would have laughed at anybody who called it one. It is closer to a set of manners, learned in a nursery in Hertfordshire, and finished in a room full of wounded men before she was old enough to nurse them. It carried a frightened man through a job that terrified him, and it carried a country through the worst 5 years it has had, and it carried her through 50 years of widowhood, and it never once slipped in public in the whole of a century. Thank you for spending this evening here with me. If the few hours we have spent together tonight are the kind of thing you would like to find your way back to, you are very welcome to subscribe. And if you have anything you would like to leave behind before you go, I love going through them all. That is the best part of my week. And now let the house go quiet. The candles are out. Somewhere at the top of Scotland, the sea is still going past a small square building in the dark, the way it did every night she stood there watching it. And there is nothing left to do tonight but rest. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.